It was only a few years after Zara's wedding that Beringer decided the time had finally come. On this day, he stood at the center of the Reichstag, speaking not only to the German parliament but also to the German people, who had by now spread across the world. Beringer looked across the sea of faces, at the men who had risen to prominence and had become politicians representing the commoner class. Each of these men was wide-eyed and filled with hope, not knowing what their great Kaiser was about to say. Whatever it was, it must be important. The great Kaiser reflected on the life he had lived up until this point, and the one he had lived before being transmigrated into this world. His aging face was filled with a blissful smile as he spoke the words that nobody wanted to hear. I stand before you all today, not only the politicians whom I am eternally grateful for their service to the Reich and fatherland, but also before the people of Germany, who have stood by my side for so many years, to make a solemn announcement. One which I know will be met with condemnation from you all. As my 60th birthday is only a few months away, I have decided the time has come for me to step down as your ruler and allow the next generation to shine. Therefore, I am hereby announcing my retirement, which will begin on my upcoming birthday. In the meantime, I will begin the peaceful transition from my administration to that of my eldest son, Chancellor Hans von Kufstein. There is no man in this world more suited to the tasks required of the Kaiser, and I can assure you all that I have spent a lifetime raising my sons to take the reins. Thus, I am now passing the torch to Hans, so that he may lead the Reich to a new era of peace and prosperity. The entire crowd of politicians erupted into roars of discontent, and they were not alone. All across the Reich, those who watched this broadcast could not believe their ears. The great Kaiser was stepping down? What madness was this? He was still more than capable of fulfilling the role of Kaiser. Why, then, would he do such a thing now? Beringer noticed the frustration among the politicians at this sudden news. After all, he had not alerted anyone other than Hans of his decision. Thus, he raised his hand, commanding silence, which the people obediently gave. He then spoke once more, his voice filled with pride. I know this news is sudden, and you may all be disheartened to learn that I am stepping down from my position. However, I assure you that my son will be every bit as capable a leader as myself, if not superior. Over the past few years, most of the work from the executive branch has been conducted by Hans, not by me. This day has been a long time coming, but I assure you all that if there is ever a need for my assistance, the doors to my estate will always be open to my son and successor, Prince Hans von Kufstein. I cannot thank you all enough for your understanding, but it is my belief that the elderly should step down from their positions of power, so that the next generation has a chance to shine. I am indeed entering my later years. Thus, I plan to retire to the countryside, along with my wives, so that I can live the remainder of my days in peace. The German politicians and the people they represented immediately shifted from outrage at their great Kaiser's sudden decision to a sense of mourning. As if the man himself had suddenly passed from the world, more than a few women and girls broke into tears, feeling they had lost the man who had built their great nation. But Beringer was not content to see such grief. Thus, he stepped back and allowed his son Hans to take over. For this occasion, Hans dressed in his own imperial regalia, adorned with all the medals and honors his father had earned during his military days. The young man was the spitting image of his father, aside from his strawberry blonde hair, which he had slicked back into Beringer's signature hairstyle for the event. He then spoke to the politicians and the German people with a voice filled with determination. I understand your lament. I truly do. Nobody in this world admired my father, the great Kaiser, the father of the German nation, and the blessed saint of the German Church, more than I do. However, as he has expressed, our great Kaiser is getting on in years and has decided that the tasks required of him as the leader of our people are a burden he no longer has the strength to bear. Therefore, he has asked me, the Crown Prince of the German Reich, to take over. The torch has been passed to the next generation, and I promise you all that the future of the German people lies not only on earth but among the stars. I will work tirelessly to expand the Reich's land and resources so that no entity may ever oppose our might again. Glory to the Kaiser, glory to the fatherland, and glory to the German people. Hail victory! Immediately after these words, Hans raised his hand in salute to the German people, who stood up from their seats, wherever they were watching this speech, and wiped the tears from their eyes before returning the salute. The loud shout of the German people, echoing the battle cry that had won them so much in this world, could be heard around the globe. Hail victory! Berenger stepped back from the Reichstag podium, a bitter smile on his face as he entered the hallways. He listened to his son's speech, which continued to inspire the German people to follow their new Kaiser. Berenger had no regrets in life, but after dedicating himself to power and authority for so long, it was almost bewildering to suddenly become just another elderly citizen of the empire. At least, he now had more time to spend with his parents, who were nearing the end of their lives, and his grandchildren, the true future of the German Reich. Thus, Berenger left the Reichstag with a far more joyful smile, thinking about the glorious future he had built for his people. Once outside, he was greeted by 10 of his 11 women, the only one absent being Brynhild. They comforted him as he embarked on a new venture in life, having laid down his crown. Linda, Adela, Honoria, Yasmin, Rio, Henrietta, Priya, Plexicli, and Granny, and Corrigan all gathered around and hugged Berenger, who looked back at the Reichstag and the civilization he had built nearly from scratch, a proud smile on his aging but handsome face. He then embraced his 10 women and stood silently for a moment before finally speaking his thoughts. "Let's go home." His 10 lovers agreed without a word, nodding their heads and following him into the armored limousine that would transport them back to the palace, where they all enjoyed a nice meal, a warm bath, and each other's company for the remainder of the evening. However, what were the consequences of Germany's great Kaiser stepping down? What events would follow such a monumental change? Well, the story of Hans the Black-Hearted was about to begin, as the new Kaiser led the German war machine against the Slavic peoples in a brutal conquest aimed at Germanizing their neighbors. As promised, Germany would expand its land and resources, and in doing so, defeat a potential enemy that would never achieve the greatness it had in Berenger's past life, because they themselves would become German. Almost immediately after Hans succeeded his father as Kaiser, he declared that he would annex the Kingdom of Poland, which lay on the eastern border of the German Reich. The reasoning was simple: by now, there were enough German citizens living in Poland, who had migrated there after the Crusade to help rebuild, that it could be considered a semi-German state. Thus, Hans planned to annex the territory in its entirety and Germanize its Slavic population throughout his reign as Kaiser. After all, one of his brides was a Polish princess, and she had already been thoroughly Germanized. The annexation of Poland was welcomed by many of the people who lived in the backward feudal state. Though they had been a vassal of the German Reich for decades, Germany had never helped modernize their nation to match the fatherland and its colonies. As a result, they were operating largely with medieval technology, albeit with an improved agricultural system. But to be annexed by the Reich meant entering a new era of peace and prosperity, where they too could live the luxurious lives of the German people. The cost was their national identity, culture, and language, but that would come later. For now, the Polish people were simply happy to bask in the wealth and power of the German Reich as its newest residents. Currently, Hans was meeting with the current Polish king, who was a relative of Natalia, who was, of course, by her husband's side during these negotiations. The Polish throne had undergone several successions since Berenger first annihilated their army during the Crusades. It was now a distant cousin, roughly Natalia's age, who was their current king. This man was not what Hans expected from a king. He was particularly slothful, as if even attending this meeting was the most tiresome chore he had ever had to deal with. He had mid-length amber hair and a clean-shaven face. His pale blue eyes added to his striking appearance. In many ways, he looked similar to Natalia. Despite his decent appearance, the man rested his head on the palm of his hand as he sat in a chair in his office. His words were laced with laziness as he spoke to Hans with a disinterested look on his face. "So, you wish to annex Poland and incorporate it into the Reich?" Although I believe I already know the answer, I still feel obligated to ask why. And don't peddle that propaganda about Poland being Germany 2.0. You and I both know better than that. A stern expression appeared on Hans' face. He flexed his fingers in contemplation for a few moments before finally voicing his intentions with a grim tone. The answer is simple. I intend to annihilate the Rus and resettle their lands with Germans. Poland is in the way, and thus, I intend to annex your kingdom and incorporate it into the Reich. I am not a fan of disconnected borders for a myriad of reasons. You can remain king of Poland for all I care, but Poland will be brought into the new age. We will invest in infrastructure, education, military outposts, airfields, and more. By this time next decade, Poland will become just another state of the Reich. Or we can invade your country, topple your dynasty, and incorporate Poland as part of Greater Prussia. The choice is yours." There was not a hint of fear in the Polish king's face. In fact, all that really existed was an expression of complete and total exhaustion. The man sighed heavily and groaned before agreeing to Hans' demands. After all, there was no point in fighting against the Reich. Everyone knew how powerful their military was, and if they wanted Poland, there was nothing the Polish could do to stop them. "Very well, Poland is yours to do with as you please. Just make sure I retain my status of nobility and my family's fortune. I would hate to have to move out of this palace. It seems like a lot of work." Hans could not believe the man's reason for wanting his title and fortune. It was simply because he felt moving was too much work. He had never before met such a lazy king. But if there was one upside, it meant that the annexation of Poland would be a simple matter. Thus, Hans pulled out a contract, signing over the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Poland to the Kaiser of the German Reich and the von Kufstein dynasty. The man did not even bother reading the contract as he signed on the dotted line, as if doing so was a hassle not worth the effort. This surprised Hans once more, who looked over at Natalia for an explanation of why this man was the way he was. But the Polish beauty simply sighed and shook her head, as if her cousin had always been this way. How this man had ever ended up as the King of Poland, Hans did not know, but he suspected that either his father or mother was responsible for it, perhaps preparing for his ascension to the throne. With this settled, Hans got up from the meeting and exited the Polish palace, where he immediately gave the green light for the German occupation of Poland. The Reich soldiers and engineers would ensure the defense of their new eastern borders while also aiding in construction efforts so that Poland could be rapidly modernized into a proper nation-state. Within the hour, German troops had arrived in the tens of thousands. Much to the surprise of the Polish people, who were naturally unaware of the Reich's plans to annex them, Hans had announced it shortly after claiming his rightful place as the next German Kaiser. Hand in hand with Natalia, whom he had known since childhood, Hans smiled as they saw the German tanks and IFVs roll by. Walking through this Polish city reminded Hans of the world before his father had begun to change everything. After all, Hans had a good enough memory to recall the early days of his life when his father had marched off to war with muskets and cannons. Poland was almost exactly the same as Austria had been back then, in its current technological state. Hans couldn't help but comment on this. "It is amazing what the Reich has become in a matter of decades. To think that I used to live in a world just like this. Many memories are now flooding my mind about the way life used to be, back when it was simpler." Natalia nodded in complete understanding. It had been decades since Eckhard had taken her from her father's side and dragged her to Kufstein as a prize for the von Kufstein dynasty. She never imagined she would become the Kaiser's wife or that she would be happy to see the banners of the German Reich proudly flying over her homeland's castles. However, after a lifetime of being raised in Germany, she was no longer a Polish woman, even if she was technically a former princess of their kingdom. She had been thoroughly Germanized, in culture and blood. After all, she had married a German man and given birth to German children. Though her children were technically considered half-breeds by the Reich, her grandchildren would be considered German citizens, and that was good enough for her. She looked over at Hans with a happy smile on her pretty face before saying the words she had long meant to convey to her husband. "I'm glad I was raised as your family's ward. I can't imagine what my life would have been like if I had been raised by my biological parents in Poland. And I hope you can do for my people what your father did for yours." Hans hugged his wife tightly and kissed her on the forehead before expressing his intentions for Poland and its people. In 2 generations, the Polish will be considered another German state. And by then, our children will be their rulers. But more importantly, Poland will be the staging ground from which I shall strike at the Rus. After all, I have a debt that is yet to be paid in full, and I will not rest until the entire male bloodline of the Rus population is annihilated from this world. Natalia nuzzled her head against her husband's chest. Like his father before him, he was a vengeful man. However, unlike Brimir, Hans had inherited his mother's cruelty. Because of this, he did not consider his vengeance complete, even after maiming the former Grand Duke of Moscow. No, retribution would not be paid in full until the entirety of the Rus population felt his wrath. Field Marshal Adelbrand stood in the headquarters of the German Department of Defense. On his screen was a visual of the ongoing situation in the Russian states. It had been well over a year since the Reich first annexed Poland, and during this time, they had begun shipping weapons to the various factions engaged in the ongoing Russian Civil War. In previous conflicts, the German High Command had always met within the Kaiser's palace, simply because Brimir did not want to leave the comforts of his own home while commanding the war effort. However, after inheriting his father's throne and palace, Hans did away with this tradition and instead built a dedicated headquarters within the city of Kufstein. By now, both the rebels and the boyars had access to relatively modern firearms, which they used to slaughter each other en masse. Hans had done this to ensure that the most blood was spilled during the conflict before he sent in his own forces to clean up what remained. Currently, the only German troops in the region were special operations soldiers performing reconnaissance roles. While German jets could fly over the region and capture images of the conflict, it was sometimes best to have troops on the ground to properly observe what was happening. These soldiers were dressed in Flecktarn camouflage, with modern plate carriers, high-cut ballistic helmets, night vision goggles with thermal clip-ons, and ghillie hoods. They blended well into the Eastern European environment, and their body camera footage was displayed on the screen within the German version of the Pentagon. The leader of the squadron spoke softly into his comms as he aimed down the 4-14x magnified optic of his designated marksman rifle, a weapon that resembled the SVCH sniper rifle, a prototype during Berenger's past life. The weapon had an optic, a suppressor, a bipod, a white light, and an IR illuminator/laser. It was painted with a woodland camouflage pattern, and ghillie netting covered it, making it almost impossible to see from the distance at which the sniper and his fire team were currently situated. While observing the ongoing chaos in a nearby village, he requested permission to take out the local boyar, who was hiding behind the wall of his castle. His loyal soldiers were firing on the crowd of armed civilians who had laid siege to it. Target is in sight, approximately 800 meters out. Permission to terminate the objective? Adelbrand's voice could be heard on the other line, denying the sniper permission to take the shot. Negative, you are there to observe and perform reconnaissance, not to conduct assassinations. This remark annoyed the sniper. He was watching a town engulfed in flames, as the boyar's men massacred the uprising civilians by the hundreds. It was not something that most men could simply sit by and watch. And yet, he was ordered to stand down and observe the chaos. He could not understand what High Command wanted, and he voiced his confusion as gunshots echoed in the distance. Sir, hundreds of women and children lie dead, and more are being killed every second. Give me the order to fire, and I can end this massacre once and for all. Despite his protest, Adelbrand's words were cold and emotionless as he again declined the order to eliminate the boyar. I'm sorry, Sergeant, but the Kaiser does not wish for that to happen. You will observe and report until the battle is concluded. That is all. After hearing this, the sniper let go of the pistol grip and pounded his hand into the dirt. He could not believe that the new Kaiser was willing to sit by and watch as these people were massacred. Wasn't the whole goal of this operation to annihilate the Rus males and take the women and girls back home for marriage and betrothal? If that was the case, then by the time the full-scale invasion began, there would be no women and girls left to marry. In the air above Novgorod, a reconnaissance drone flew proudly. It was being operated by a member of the Luftwaffe, who was sitting back and pounding an energy drink in the comfort of the fatherland. The drone continued to survey the city below, and the fires that were raging across its territory. Riots had broken out in Novgorod for the 11th time this month. The people were armed and firing upon the boyar's men, who returned fire. Looting was common, and rape was rampant. This was not exclusive to Novgorod. In fact, all major Rus cities were suffering similar riots as people behaved like animals in an attempt to overthrow the nobles who ruled over them with an iron fist. The information from this drone was reported directly back to the headquarters of the Department of Defense, where Adelbrand observed alongside the footage being streamed by troops on the ground. It was becoming increasingly clear that this civil war was reaching a climax, and when that happened, the Reich would initiate an invasion of the Rus states. This invasion would require at most 100,000 men to end things within a year's time. This allowed for absolute mobility, whether with light tactical vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, utility helicopters, or jet-powered transport aircraft. The Reich was already preparing its forces in the nearest borders and air bases. When the signal was given, 100,000 men would deploy in full force, while the 5,000 special operators, already behind enemy lines, would receive the order to act as the spearhead of the operation. They would invade Russian towns and cities, destroying the male population. Meanwhile, the rank and file of the German army would capture the women and girls and bring them back to the Reich for processing. Once the war was over, German men would repopulate the region with their wives, while the Russian women and girls were dispersed across the fatherland and its colonies for Germanization. Naturally, they would only be married off once they were of legal age to do so. This would be a swift and brutal war, one that would end the Russian bloodline once and for all. Instead, a new breed of Germans, similar to the Prussians, would emerge in the east. The German Empire would not halt its conquest until all of Siberia was under its control. Beringer sat in the countryside of Austria, far from the hustle and bustle of the metropolis he once created. Living in the village of Hallstatt brought a unique kind of peace, one he cherished in his old age. The small mountain village surrounded a beautiful crystal-clear lake, where Beringer would often sit on the beach with his wives, drink beer, and enjoy the outdoors, something he hadn't been able to do properly for years. The stress of running the world's mightiest empire evaporated overnight as Beringer retreated to the countryside with his wives and concubines. Each day was bliss. He savored the finest home-cooked food, made love to as many beautiful women, and occasionally, his children would visit with their own families, where he would play the part of a doting grandfather. Despite all this, his son and successor were preparing for the largest military operation the Reich had engaged in for the last 30 years. But that was none of Beringer's concern. His son had not called for support, and since he hadn't, the retired Kaiser of the German Reich assumed his son, Hans, had everything under control. At the moment, Beringer was lying face down on a towel while his wife Itami, along with Korigin and Angrani, competed to give him a proper massage. Years of stress had accumulated in Beringer's body, even seeping into his bones. Because of this, his wives took turns each day, giving him an oil massage, which often ended in an orgy. Though Beringer was already 60 years old, he did not look it. His body was in phenomenal shape, and his six-pack was well maintained. The lines on his face were less pronounced than usual, and his hair had only recently begun to gray, with many streaks of golden blonde. However, the moment he handed over the reins of the German government to his son, he had removed his Eye of Horus and given it to his son. Though Hans had yet to perform the ceremony to harness the powers of the ancient deity, Beringer was left with only one eye. Or so one might think. To heal his wounds, he was once more granted permission to dip into the mystical waters of the secluded Norse village in Iceland. Healing all the wounds and scars he had suffered over the year, and increasing his vitality, this was partly why he appeared much younger than a man of his age should. Of course, this only caused his women to become jealous, and thus, they too bathed in the mystical waters. This gave them the appearance of 40-year-olds, despite being in their 50s and 60s. So long as Beringer and his women made a trip to Iceland once a month to bathe in these waters, they could forestall the aging process of their bodies, at least in terms of appearance. The wear and tear on their bodies could never be fully replenished, at least not in the mortal world. Thus, even though Yasmin was nearly 63 years old, she appeared like a 40-year-old mature beauty. This allowed Beringer to be sexually aroused by his women's appearance, even as they aged. While enjoying the massage from his women, as he lay naked on the private section of the beach afforded to his villa, Beringer gazed up at the bright blue sky, completely devoid of clouds, and could not help but think about his old job. I wonder how close Zara is to reaching Mars. Itami instantly leaned down and kissed Beringer on the lips, her way of taking the man off work now that he was enjoying his life of retirement. This only caused Beringer to chuckle as he grabbed the mature albino beauty and rolled into the dirt with her. The oil on his skin attracted the sand, which glued itself to him as he kissed Itami with a fierce display of passion. The woman could not help but let her husband do as he pleased, as she had always done since she first learned he was the same man she had loved in her past life. Beringer simply smiled as he peeled the woman's bikini bottom aside and thrust his length into her tight, moist entrance. Despite giving him 5 children, Beringer never seemed to tire of his wives and concubines, all of whom he loved with a fierce passion. The moment Berenger began to pound Tommy on the beach, his other wives realized it was that time again and began to strip out of their attire before joining their husband in rival in the sand. Their little orgy ended after 2 hours of non-stop sex, after which they retired to their villa's washroom for a second round. Once they were fully clean and their lust had been exhausted, the 10 women and their man sat down at the dining room table. The 3 greatest cooks in the harem prepared a large and delicious meal for them all to enjoy. Berenger sat with a liter of beer in hand, gazing upon the many beautiful women he had collected over the years, and made a toast. All the women were quick to agree. To a well-deserved retirement. The women clanked their glasses together and drank whatever they were feasting on that night. Most of them drank alcohol like their husbands, but as a devout Muslim, Yasmin abstained. Instead, she drank grape juice to mimic the flavor of wine. At the head of the table sat Berenger, enjoying his meal. To his left was Itami, and to his right was Linda. The reasoning was clear to every woman in the dining hall. They were Berenger's 2 favored wives, and they had all become well accustomed to this arrangement. As Berenger dined on the home-cooked meals of his wives, he couldn't help but smile. He had never imagined what retired life would be like, but thanks to the powers of his ancestors' ancient gods, he was able to enjoy it in a way he had never thought possible. Despite their retirement, many of the women, like Berenger, found themselves thinking about their old jobs. Henrietta was among them, voicing her concerns about the ongoing state of the economy. With the transfer of power between Berenger and Hans, I wonder how the stock market is looking right now. I haven't been on a computer for days. Big Brother has kept Adela and me incredibly busy lately. Do you think the people have faith in their new Kaiser? Or do you think the markets took a hit, knowing that the man who built this great nation has suddenly decided to step down? The other women glared at Henrietta. They were all trying their best not to remind their husband that he was retired and had nothing meaningful left to do. That was why they had all spent so much time with him these past few days, making love to him. It was their best way of keeping his mind off the past. After all, Berenger had lived a lifetime of politics and war. To suddenly step aside and devote his entire time to hedonistic pleasure was not an easy thing to do. Henrietta immediately realized her mistake and blushed. But it was too late. Berenger's mind had shifted to matters of state, and he had already reassured his role as Kaiser as he spoke about his opinions on the matter. It took a slight hit, but Hans has shown that he is as capable as I was. In fact, he might be even more capable. I was never born for the role of a monarch, nor was I explicitly trained in government management. I made a lot of it up on the path to victory and luckily had many talented people to take care of matters I did not understand. Hans, like all of my sons, was born and raised to lead the German nation. Even my sons who had no chance of claiming the throne for themselves were raised that way. And I suspect they will raise their sons similarly. So, although his ascension to the throne is recent, and it will take some time for people to gain faith in his rule, I suspect he will lead the Reich to a bright future. Berenger then immediately returned to his schnitzel, much to the surprise of all his wives and concubines. Normally, when they got him started on the subject of politics or economics, he would go off on an hour-long rant, as if reliving the days of his youth. But after nearly a year of this retired life, it was starting to seem like he had finally begun to accept it. Thus, while Hans was busy preparing for a war with the Rus states, Berenger was enjoying a peaceful and hedonistic life at his lakeside villa. Hans sat at the dining table within the royal palace of Austria, along with his entire family. The man had inherited a vast domain, both in terms of the Reich's expansive land and the family fortune, which was practically a second treasury in its own right. Along with this came the grand place of Kufstein, which Berenger had established in his hometown, transforming it from a small agricultural town into a thriving metropolis and the center of the modern world. Around the table sat Hans' many children from his 5 wives. Although Hans had married 5 different women, only 2 of his wives were capable of producing offspring who met the requirements to compete for the German throne. The rest would have to follow a similar path as their uncles. Ansgar, the son of von Wittelsbach and Hans, was fiercely competing with one of his half-brothers. Little Berenger, the child of Hans and Veronica, was not to be confused with his grandfather and uncle, both of whom shared his name. Though he was the same age as Ansgar, little Berenger was in fierce competition with his half-brother. Both boys had inherited their father's intelligence and spent their every waking hour improving their skills in every field they trained in, whether it was martial arts, firearms, history, mathematics, science, politics, economics, and more. These two boys competed in every way they could think of, and even now, at the dinner table, their blue eyes did not waver from each other. That is, until Hans asked his son Ansgar a particular question, which left the boy stumped. "So, Ansgar, I hear that you and Elsa have become quite fond of one another." "That is good. Family is important, but you should remember not to get too attached to her. After she completes her education here in the Reich, she will be returned to her family, who will undoubtedly marry her off to the most appropriate suitor." Ansgar flushed red with embarrassment when his father said this and was quick to protest, which only further revealed the thoughts he had toward his younger cousin. "It's not like that, Dad. Elsa and I are friends, that is all." Little Beringer witnessed his rival's flustered expression and went in for the kill, all while cutting up his schnitzel with the civility of a prince. "Oh, how cute! Ansgar likes Elsa." Ansgar flashed his half-brother a vicious look, which only cemented the smug smile on the boy's face. Hans simply shook his head. He had no idea how his father had managed to raise all of his siblings to be so harmonious with one another. Overwhelmed with preparations for the invasion of the Rus, this was his first time eating dinner with his family in over a week. Yet, every time he saw these two boys, they were always at each other's throats. In all honesty, Hans did not remember ever competing with any of his siblings for the throne in any meaningful capacity. They all seemed to just be aware that he was the oldest and the most intelligent of them all. But perhaps that was because his father and mother had him years ahead of his half-brothers. As for Ansgar and little Beringer, they were born on the exact same day and were equal in intellect and wit. Thus, they were natural-born rivals. Before Ansgar could respond to his half-brother's taunt, which, judging by the expression on his face, he clearly wanted to, Hans put a stop to his son's petty dispute. "That's enough. Beringer, quit instigating things with your brother. So what if he likes Elsa? You're both still children, and for many reasons which I do not wish to discuss right now, I won't be betrothing any of you to your cousins." There was a visible look of disappointment on Ansgar's face when he heard that he would not be betrothed to Elsa, which little Beringer found satisfying. The obvious instance of schadenfreude only further convinced Hans that his wives were doing something wrong in raising their children, and that despite his burdens, he would need to take a more active role in their parenting. Thus, he sighed heavily before taking a swig from his chalice. Once he was finished, Hans commanded his son to apologize. "Beringer, apologize to your brother. You were clearly in the wrong by teasing him, and I will not tolerate your petty rivalry. I know you both wish to inherit my throne, but this is supposed to be a friendly competition, not one of personal animosity. If neither of you can understand that, I will consider you both unfit to rule this nation and will instead confer the title of heir to one of your younger siblings." The young boy, who shared the same name as his illustrious grandfather, immediately panicked when he heard that his chances of inheriting the throne would be forfeit if he failed to reconcile with his brother. Thus, he bowed his head and apologized, though he felt aggrieved by his father's words. "Very well, I'm sorry, Ansgar. I should have treated you with more respect." Ansgar looked at his father, the Kaiser, and understood that he, too, was being implicated in this. Though he wanted to dismiss little Beringer's so-called apology, he did not do so. Instead, he accepted it with the grace befitting a prince. Apology accepted. Anne and Veronica gazed at each other in disbelief as they saw their sons become amicable to one another for the first time in years. They had tried non-stop to discipline the cheeky little rascals, and yet nothing worked. Yet, with one quip from their father, they suddenly fell in line. How was this fair? Despite their feelings, the two women kept their thoughts to themselves. They would allow Hans to properly take care of their children's discipline from now on. After all, he was the only one who could threaten these little kids with something they actually feared. The dinner remained respectful after this, with Hans speaking to each of his children in a desperate attempt to catch up with their lives. After the meal, he sent them back to their rooms to prepare for the rest of the evening, while he himself entered his bedroom with a glass of wine in hand. The 5 women who were Hans' brides gathered together to help the man remove his tie and dress in something more relaxed. As they did so, he could not help but comment on the current state of their family. I don't know how he did it. This remark caught the women off guard, and it was finally Noemi who asked the question after several moments of awkward silence. Are you referring to your father? Hans nodded, then drained the rest of his wine before placing the glass on a nearby end table. He then began his rant about his father and his true thoughts about the man. When I was young, the old man was absent from my life quite often. It was a different era, where a king could ride on horseback at the front of a formation if he was so daring. And my father was the best at it. The man was in the trenches at Vienna along with his men, eating the same food as them, living in the same brutal conditions, and even staying up on watch at night so they could sleep soundly. Yet, whenever he returned from war, he never let the horrors he had witnessed affect any of us. He tried his best to make up for lost time. However, the work of a Kaiser is never finished, and he spent most of his days secluded in his office overseeing the development of the Reich. Still, none of us ever had the problems that our sons and daughters do. I just don't understand how he was able to provide such stable direction for us all while still running the nation so effectively. Meanwhile, here I am drowning in paperwork and barely managing to keep those boys from tearing each other's throats out. Hans then gazed upon the portrait of his father, which hung proudly in his room, and could not help but question himself as a ruler, especially when compared to a man now revered by the German people. How can I possibly compare to you? The 5 wives of the Kaiser gathered together and hugged the man, comforting him. None more so than Veronica, who told him exactly what he needed to hear. If you're struggling, perhaps you should speak with the man. I'd been a part of your family long enough to know the truth about what happened between your father and his brother. As much as we don't like to speak about it, I can't help but worry Ansgar and Berenger might follow the path of Lambert. Your father may be retired, but he is just a phone call away. I am sure he would be more than happy to speak with you. Upon hearing this, Hans wore a bitter smile and looked up at his father's portrait one last time. He had tried his best until now to distance himself from the old man in an attempt to build his own legacy, but it was clear that he needed some proper fatherly advice. Thus, he decided that the time had come to visit his father and interrupt the man's peaceful retirement. Hans stood outside the gates of his father's mountain villa. The village of Hallstatt was situated around a lake, surrounded by mountains. Because of this, there was very little land available for development. Yet, Berenger had managed to purchase most of what he could to construct his retirement home. In fact, it was the perfect secluded paradise, one that Berenger seemed to enjoy immensely. However, Hans had not informed his parents about his visit, so he knocked on the door while Berenger and his wives were being intimate. At first, the residents did not acknowledge his knock. But after pressing the doorbell several times, his mother answered, wearing only a nightgown that barely covered her voluptuous body. Hans could hardly believe his eyes when he saw his mother's appearance. Linda was supposed to be 56 years old, but she looked 16 years younger. This was truly shocking, but not as much as when his father's voice echoed from the halls, followed by his own figure appearing. Linda, dear, who's at the door? A pretty smile formed on Linda's beautiful face as she called out to her husband, who was dressed in nothing but a pair of compression shorts. It's Hans. I think we should probably get dressed. Berenger stared at his son, who looked as if he were seeing a ghost. Berenger, despite being 60, looked 20 years younger, and his missing eyeball had been replaced with a clear sapphire iris. Hans felt as if he were having a stroke and quickly asked what had happened to his parents. Why do the two of you look so young? The last time I saw you, you were ancient. Why do you look roughly my age? Berenger chuckled as he approached the door and playfully slapped Linda's ass before letting his son inside. This action caused Linda to blush and hug her husband with a pretty smile on her face. However, Hans looked on in horror. Must his father always behave this way? Realizing his son was speechless, Berenger spoke to his wife and asked her to prepare some tea and cookies. Linda dear, be a doll and fetch Hans and me some tea and cookies. There are some things we need to discuss. Linda bowed her head in deference to her husband and obeyed his request. Afterward, Berenger pulled on a nearby robe that had been sitting on the coat rack and covered himself. He then led his son to the dining room, where he offered him the seat across from himself. Once seated, Hans felt he could no longer contain his curiosity and asked the question that was most important to him. How? How the hell? What the fuck happened to you two? Brimir chuckled at this and began to explain his situation to the boy. There's a pool in Iceland with miraculous effects. I told you about the gods already. Well, this is their blessing to me. Although my body is still aging, the process has been slowed down, and your mother and I have regained the last 20 years of our lives. Who knows, we might live to be 100 and still appear to be half our age when we finally pass away. It's not important. The only thing it has really done is allow me to be more sexually attracted to your mother. I'm still going to die in 40 years. Oh, speaking of which, I made a deal with Odin a while back that ensures our family, and yes, all of our descendants, will end up in our own personal afterlife. I may have forgotten to mention this to you earlier, but none of it is really important. What brings you here, Hans? It's been months since I last saw you, and now you show up unannounced. Is everything all right? Hans gazed at his father, who appeared roughly the same age as himself, with complete and total shock on his face. If he had been skeptical about the existence of ancient deities before, he was now a full-fledged believer. However, he quickly collected his thoughts and spoke about the troubles he was having. It's about my sons. They are a bit too competitive with each other, and I fear it's only a matter of time before they end up like you and Lambert. Linda walked in at that exact moment, handed her husband and son their tea, and placed a plate of cookies on the table. She then chose to sit in Berenger's lap, while the man eyed his son with a concerned expression. It took Berenger several moments to think through his thoughts before he began to speak. Hans, what happened between your uncle and me was the failure of my parents. My only regret in life is that I couldn't share everything I built with my little brother. He died hating me more than anyone, and I have no doubt he continues to hold that resentment in the afterlife. If your sons have developed a fierce sense of rivalry, one that's starting to become worrisome, you need to spend time with them and teach them what I taught you and your siblings when you were young. Family matters more than anything. My grandsons are of my bloodline, and they need to be reminded of this. It doesn't matter which of them sits on the throne, what matters is that we all work together. It is the von Kufstein family against the world, and it always has been. So long as my descendants continue to understand this, it always will be. Let me ask you this, Hans, how many hours a day do you work? Berenger began to take a sip of his tea as Hans answered the question with a nonchalant expression. About 16 hours a day, on average. Why? Berenger nearly choked on his tea when he heard this answer, and even Linda had an uncomfortable expression on her face. This confused Hans, who was only following his father's example. It took Berenger some effort to swallow his tea before he chastised his son for being an idiot. Why the fuck are you working 16 hours a day? You're the fucking Kaiser. You can work 4 hours a day, and nobody would give a shit. This response startled Hans, who looked at his father and mother, both of whom had disapproving expressions. He could not understand this and quickly voiced his disagreement. What the hell do you mean? You always worked 16 hours a day. Berenger suddenly realized where the problem lay and immediately sighed, shaking his head before explaining his reasoning to his son, who appeared confused. Hans, I worked 16 hours a day because I was building an empire from scratch. The Reich is already built. There are no enemies for you to fight that are worth such effort. The world belongs to Germany. You don't need to follow my example. You can work 4 to 8 hours a day, and it will be sufficient to get your work done. No wonder your children are at odds with one another. You are never around to parent them. I could get away with that because you all had a strong maternal figure like your mother to rein you in. And as much as I love my daughters-in-law, you don't have a strong, supportive figure like Linda to hold the family together. That responsibility falls on you as the head of the house. Hans, you need to cut your hours in half and spend more quality time with your family, especially your sons. You need to guide them on the path to manhood. While you may be teaching them the qualities a ruler must have, without your guidance, they could end up treacherous and backstabbing. A father is essential for his children to grow up with proper character. For a ruler, character is even more important than ability. Hans suddenly felt as if he had been an idiot. His father's words made sense. There was no need for him to perfectly emulate his father. He needed to do things his own way, ensuring that the empire his father built was not only maintained but also expanded at a healthy rate. The major wars the German Empire would fight had already been won. Now, maintaining its hegemony was the priority, and that was relatively easy, at least compared to the goal of conquest. Thus, even though he had just started his conversation with his father, Hans had already learned so much. It was true that one's journey is never complete in life. Despite being an adult and the new Kaiser, there was still much his retired father could teach him, not only about being a monarch, but also about being a man. Hans sat in the chair, which his father had granted him permission to use. In one hand, he held a glass of tea, and in the other, a cookie. He seemed to be enjoying the conversation he was having with the old man at that moment, though he still had a hard time believing his eyes. After all, both his father and mother appeared 20 years younger than they should be, which was definitely abnormal in this world. Despite his astonishment, Hans maintained his professionalism as he spoke about the ongoing situation with the Rus states. Currently, the Rus kingdoms are engaged in a series of bloody civil wars. We have provided weapons and munitions to both factions. Essentially, anyone who wants to get their hands on a submachine gun can do so, and this has increased the casualty rate among the Rus. They seem more than happy to kill each other, Hans noted. Beringer nodded in understanding. The Rus were never really a problem for him, simply because he had maintained a constant supply of cheap alcohol in those lands. But Siberia was a vast wasteland rich in natural resources. Why would Germany be content to hand over those resources to the Rus? Once they managed to industrialize in a few centuries, it could pose a serious problem for the global balance of power. Thus, he approved of his son's decision to take preemptive actions to prevent this from happening. However, it was clear to Beringer that his son harbored a special kind of hatred for the Rus, one that would not be extinguished until he had eradicated their people from the world. This prompted Beringer to ask about the origins of this hate, a sentiment he was all too familiar with. After all, in his past life, his family had been particularly disdainful of the Russians for the atrocities they committed during the Second World War and the Bolshevik Revolution. But neither of those two incidents occurred in this world's history, so he could only presume it had to do with that little incident with Veronica all those years ago. I take it you plan to wipe out the male bloodline of the Russian population and integrate their women into our empire as secondary wives of German men? Am I correct in this line of thinking? Hans was not surprised that his father had seen through his plans. After all, he had never met anyone with an intellect on par with his own, which undoubtedly came from his father and was also present in his half-siblings like Zara. Thus, he smiled and nodded his head, confirming this was the case. I can never hide things from you, father. Yes, that is the plan. Beringer nodded as he took a sip from his teacup, then replied to his son's statement with a deeply personal question. And I presume this hatred you have toward the Russian people stems from what that little cunt tried to do to Veronica? Far be it from me to condemn your actions. The gods know I am guilty of my own purges. I'm just trying to understand where your anger toward the Russians comes from. After all, unlike me, you are not aware of what they did to our people in my past life. Hans narrowed his eyes when he heard this question and responded with a question of his own, a flicker of rage in his eyes and a vicious tone in his voice. What did they do? Beringer scoffed as he informed Hans about some particularly brutal affairs he would never be able to forget, despite not experiencing them himself. In the year 1918, the Russian Empire collapsed after being defeated by Germany in what was then known as the Great War. A civil war ensued. And during this civil war, the Bolsheviks, a group of Russian and Jewish communists, targeted the Volga Germans. These were Germans who had migrated to Russia to assist with agriculture and had lived there for several decades. Many Volga Germans were persecuted and killed, with the intensity increasing after the Second World War began. The Russians massacred about 1.5 million Volga Germans. Of course, we lost the war, and as a result, the Russians raped between 2 to 4 million German women and girls, some as young as 8 years old, with some women being raped up to 60 times. Naturally, we are not entirely innocent in this matter. We killed many Russians during the war, leading me to believe that the massacre of the Volga Germans was a form of retaliation. However, the deaths of civilians during military operations are not the same as an organized rape and massacre of millions of people. I am telling you this specifically because the animosity between our people and the Russians transcends timelines. I would not be surprised if this animosity existed in every conceivable timeline. If you can end this animosity once and for all, then you have my full support, especially if it means putting an end to the hatred in your heart. Although, I doubt Veronica cares as much about that past incident as you seem to. Hans was surprised to hear all of this had happened in his father's life and quickly asked the immediate question on his mind. Father, did you witness all of this? If what you say is true, I can't imagine why you didn't get rid of the Russians yourself. Contrary to what Hans expected, Brimir simply scoffed, took another sip of his tea, and shook his head. He then explained his views on the matter. No, I was several generations removed from these issues. By the time I was born, most people seemed to have either forgotten about these grievances or simply didn't care. Only the most nationalistic and stubborn German families, most of which existed outside the fatherland, would still harbor such hatred over matters that happened before they were born. I was raised in one of these households, but I must admit that the hatred towards the Russians that my parents had seemed so foreign to me. Partly because I was born and raised in another country, and partly because my political ideology was more in line with the modern Russians than the country I fought for. This is why I did nothing more than keep the Russians down by flooding their society with cheap liquor. If I shared my parents' disdain for the Russians, perhaps I would have taken your approach. So while I can understand your justifications for the actions you're about to take, and I support them, I personally do not share your hatred. Now, Hans, if there is nothing else you wish to speak about, I believe it's time for you to return to Kufstein. It's getting late, and your mother and I have plans for the evening. So, I wish you the best of luck in your upcoming campaign, though I know you don't need it. Hans immediately rose from his chair, shook his father's hand, and thanked him for the chat, which cleared up many of his misunderstandings. Thank you, Father, for the discussion. It was enlightening. He then headed out the door. After hearing what you have to say about the Russians from your past life, I believe I will be doing the world a favor by eliminating their barbaric bloodline once and for all. Goodbye, Father. I will be sure to visit you and Mother more frequently from now on. Brimir smiled and sent his son on his way with a wave of his hand. After Hans was gone, he looked over at a nearby globe and shook his head before expressing his thoughts aloud. It is a pity that the Russian civilization will come to an end before it has time to flourish in this timeline. But I suppose it is necessary for the continued survival and stability of the Reich. After saying this, Brimir placed his teacup on the table and walked away from the living room, where he enjoyed the rest of his evening in the company of his many wives and concubines. Nearly 6 months had passed since Hans first inherited the throne from his retired father. During this time, he closely monitored the civil war within the Rus states. It became abundantly clear to him that the longer this war continued, the more women and children would be killed. After 6 months of constant bloodshed, Kaiser Hans von Kufstein took the podium in the Reichstag to make his first declaration of war since ascending to the throne. Nearly 40 years old, he had inherited his father's good genes, making him look 5 to 10 years younger. Still handsome and unfettered by age, he made his speech, which would send the German army into the lands that would one day be Russia. My fellow Germans, there is an ongoing humanitarian crisis within the various Rus states on our eastern borders. The Orthodox Church has inspired a rebellion among the masses, and the boyars continue to buy weapons from our allies to support their cause. But who is to blame for this crisis? The Church, which compels men to kill their masters, or the nobility, who selfishly hoard the profits of their people's labor? That is something only the Lord God Almighty can judge. As the son of a living saint and the leader of the world's most supreme military power, I see it as my responsibility to intervene in this conflict to spare the women and children from the wrath their men now inflict upon them. Therefore, today, I hereby declare war on the various Rus states and will be sending a force of 100,000 men into their lands to maintain the peace and eliminate those elements that seek to harm the innocent. It has been some time since our people last went to war, and though our enemies may be primitive, they currently wield weapons purchased from our allies. I trust that each and every soldier will protect themselves to the best of their abilities, while putting an end to the suffering that our Eastern brothers and sisters now find themselves in. Glory to the Reich! And may God be with us in this dark hour of human history. After saying this, Hans descended from the podium and left the Reichstag. War was officially declared, and now 100,000 German soldiers would be marching into combat. This was something he personally did not worry too much about. The German military was vast and powerful, more so than any other nation on the planet. Every other nation on the planet could go to war with the Reich, and every other nation in the world would be defeated. Sending their forces into Russia against a bunch of knights and boyars who fired semi-automatic rifles with zero training and precision was not much of a threat. What mattered to Hans was his genocide and how he would eliminate the entire Russian male bloodline while making himself look like the good guy. Thus, he returned to the palace and waited for his troops to do their thing. As soon as the order to invade was given, 100,000 German soldiers deployed via land, sea, and air to the Russian states. Whether it was the Baltic Fleet launching Marines via landing craft, the German army traversing from Poland's eastern borders in light tactical vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks, or paratroopers and air assault units from the Luftwaffe descending from the skies via planes and helicopters, there were multiple ways in which the Germans deployed their forces. Within 3 hours, 100,000 German soldiers were within Russia's borders. The attack was swift. The previous methods by which the Germans waged war, which involved achieving peace through superior firepower, were not employed in this conflict. The war was supposed to be humanitarian, and because of this, German soldiers did not simply bombard villages, cities, and castles with artillery and bombs. Besides, such methods were now obsolete with the Reich's precision-guided munitions. Instead, they sent armored columns to enter each inhabited area, where they would then eliminate or arrest any men they found. Those who were not killed in the ensuing conflict were taken by the German armed forces to labor camps, where they would help develop Russia and Siberia for German annexation. Meanwhile, women and children were secured and protected, ensuring that no harm came to them. Combat was entirely one-sided, with the Germans' advanced body armor, communications, firearms, and other equipment. They could easily surround and eliminate hostile targets with much greater precision than their enemies. If Russian rebels and soldiers made the mistake of hunkering down in fortifications, a smart bomb could be dropped on their heads using a dedicated bomber, a multi-role fighter, a self-propelled artillery vehicle, or even aerial drones. The level of technology that the German military now had at its disposal was on par with the society Brimir had left behind after dying in Afghanistan in his previous life. Because of this, it was all too easy to annihilate the male bloodline of the Russian population. Although the German army stormed through Russian towns, cities, and castles, it managed to prevent the outside world from discovering their ulterior motives. To the rest of the world, this truly appeared to be a humanitarian operation, one for which Germany had taken responsibility, despite the weapons used by Russian rebels and boyars supposedly coming from Germany's allies, all of whom purchased their weapons from the Reich. Thus, the German propaganda machine was working in overdrive, sending images across the internet and television broadcasts of heavy fighting and the supposed massacres that were the result of the ongoing civil war. Of course, what could a water-cooled machine gun do against the hull of a Lynx IFV? Not much, and because of this, the German soldiers were able to deploy to battlefields safely, without fear of being blown up. With support from a 35mm autocannon, this was more than enough to shred the meager medieval defenses behind which the Russian rebels and loyalists hid. This resulted in a one-sided conflict. The German war machine was so brutally efficient that within 12 hours, the German flag was raised over Moscow and Novgorod, announcing the end of the previous regimes that had failed their people. Although some fighting occurred afterward, the remnants of the Russian rebels and loyalists were quickly cleared up. Thus, Russia entered a transition into a state of Germanization. Over the next generation, the Russian male population would slowly dwindle and be replaced by German citizens who would take Russian women as their brides. By the time the world awoke the next day, they were all surprised to see that the war had ended so quickly. Although many world leaders suspected such a scenario might occur, it was an incredibly easy task for the German military to wipe out hostile governments and occupy their territory with only 100,000 men. Men like Ghazi, Alexandros, Lucas, and Christopher were all too aware of how little chance the Russians had in defending their lands. The German war machine was absolute and centuries beyond the rest of the world. With this in mind, Hans and his many half-brothers, who now ruled over the world's most powerful nations, all congratulated him on the speed at which he finished the war. Meanwhile, the Germans were able to celebrate the fact that, for the first time in their history, they had fought a war without suffering a single death. Sure, some men were wounded, but not a single German soldier had died during the 12-hour war that saw the Russian states become annexed by the Reich. This overwhelming victory had secured Hans' prestige in the eyes of his people. After all, no matter how great his father was, he had not accomplished what Hans had just done. The war between the German Empire and the Russian states was over before it even really began. Within 12 hours, the German banners were raised above the smoldering cities. Though the world did not know it at the time, the new Kaiser had already begun enacting plans to eliminate the Russian bloodline from the world's history. As for Hans, after his first war as Kaiser of the German Reich was over, he felt as if all the anxiety he had endured over the past year had suddenly disappeared. He did not even know why he was so worried to begin with. With this swift victory and without a single death among his deployed forces, Hans's popularity immediately soared among the German people. Even his critics were chanting his name in toasts within the Reich's many beer halls. He had proven himself capable of leading the German Reich during conflict, and that was good enough for most of the German people. Currently, Hans's father sat on a beach with a beer in one hand and a newspaper in the other. Though the tried and true form of media was coming to an end, he still preferred a physical copy of his news. Of course, as the man who had ruled over a massive propaganda machine for several decades, Brimir could immediately spot what was nonsense and what was reality. The German media was in overdrive, exaggerating crimes against humanity allegedly committed by the Russian population against one another. However, from what Brimir could see, these incidents were likely the result of the German armed forces, and they were merely shifting the blame onto their adversaries. After all, he was already aware of his son's plan to wipe out the Russian male bloodline and integrate the female bloodline within the German Reich. After taking a sip from his beer, Brimir felt the warm hands of one of his many lovers wrap around his back and grasp his broad, muscular chest. He quickly grabbed her hands and kissed them. Judging by the skin tone, there was only one woman these hands belonged to, and he quickly called out her name as she interrupted his reading session. "Linda, my love, is there something in particular you want, or are you just feeling amorous?" The red-headed beauty scoffed at her husband's shameless words before speaking about the matters that bothered her. "How long do you think Hans will be able to keep his actions concealed from the rest of the world?" Brimir sighed, took off his sunglasses, and looked deeply into his wife's sky-blue eyes. "That depends. Theoretically, he could hide the extinction of the Russian male bloodline from the world for at least a century. But if he slips up and allows people without proper security clearance to record what is happening, it could be exposed at any moment. How he handles this will determine his reputation for the rest of history. We are all eventually judged for our actions in life. Though I have fought hard to create a society that puts its own needs above those of the rest of the world, it's not impossible that weak and naive ideals, such as human rights, might eventually infiltrate our society. If that were to happen, Hans would be despised by future generations even more than I." Linda's brow raised as she heard the phrase human rights. It was a concept entirely alien to her, and she quickly asked for more information. "Human rights, what are those?" Brimir scoffed at her question, answering with a hint of disdain in his voice. "A concept from my past life. One that evolved from Enlightenment thinking, and by extension, liberal values. Essentially, the argument was that all human life is of equal importance, and that human beings have certain inalienable rights which their governments cannot strip from them. Obviously, this notion was complete and utter nonsense, but nearly everyone in my country believed it. The truth of the matter was that by the time I died, the overwhelming majority of humans were utterly worthless. A significant minority of them contributed nothing to society and instead relied on the aid of others to survive. Fucking parasites. Hell, I guarantee you that when I died, nothing changed in that world. Society moved on without me, and only a few people mourned my death. The sad reality of this world is that only the lives of a handful of extremely capable men actually matter. These men are the only ones capable of making any real change in the world, and if they die prematurely, the fate of the world would be forever changed. But these men are 1 in 100 million, at least. In my past life, I was not one of these men. But in this world, I was the most important of them all." Linda listened to Brimir's every word and dwelled on it carefully. She knew very little about his past life, as he did not like to speak about it often. But every time she learned about what the world was like, she felt it was inferior to the one Beringer had created in this life. After listening to this rant about how much Beringer hated the world he had initially come from, Linda asked the immediate question on her mind, one which she felt needed an answer. Assuming this concept of human rights eventually develops in our society, how do you think you will be remembered? Beringer simply scoffed once more before he said this. He took another sip of his beer before bothering to respond to the question. But Linda could tell by the tone in his voice and the look on his face that he really did not want this to be the future of the world he created. If society eventually progresses in the direction it was in my previous life, future generations of Germans will refer to me as a murderer, warmonger, war profiteer, colonizer, racist, and so on. None of which really have any meaning to me. But if the foundations of German society that I have built stand strong, then I will be known as the father of the German nation, and the man who built the world's greatest empire. In my opinion, that is worth all the effort I have gone through in this life to build a thriving society. Linda nodded in understanding of Beringer's words. What would decide how he was remembered by his people was whether the beliefs he had instilled in them would stand the test of time, or if the ideals he despised would somehow emerge in a world where the Enlightenment never developed. Needless to say, Beringer was fairly confident that imperialism and monarchy would last much longer in this world than they had in his previous life. However, the future was not set in stone and could be changed at any moment. Still, he did not worry about such petty matters. As far as he was concerned, he did what he felt needed to be done and would not care if, in the distant future, when Germany was on the verge of collapse, the common people thought poorly of him and his actions. After all, he was fairly certain now that the Germanic pantheon was regaining popularity and, because of that, growing in strength. That they would be able to prevent the world from following a similar path as it had in his past life. Thus, Beringer continued to spend each day in absolute hedonism. Until his dying breath, he would enjoy the retirement he had worked hard to deserve. As for the future of this world, that was not his problem. He had done everything he could to set it on the right path, and that was all he could do as a mortal man. After all, he was not an immortal god-emperor who could sit on the throne for eternity and guide humanity as its eternal leader. Odin did not seem too concerned by this revelation. Instead, he sat upon his throne, looking happier and healthier than he had in nearly half a millennium. The man who was once on the brink of death was now in a vibrant state, boasting of Beringer's accomplishments. That man has done more than I ever could have imagined. Never would I have thought that after your tragedy, you would be compelled to bear so many children for a mortal man. How many is it now? 20, 25? Your eldest son, he is the king of Iceland now, is he not? Brynhildr had a proud smile on her face as she nodded. Excluding sir, I have 26 children, all fathered by Beringer. And yes, my eldest son is indeed the current king of Iceland. My lord, Odin, I must confess that I have been allowing Beringer and his other women to bathe in the sacred pool. Though it has not increased their lifespan, it allows them to remain youthful in appearance. I hope this is not a problem? Contrary to what Brynhildr expected, Odin simply chuckled and dismissed the issue entirely. He took a drink from a horn of mead before saying the words the beautiful Valkyrie had never expected to hear. That's fine. We have more than enough power to restore its properties 100 times over. In fact, with all the success Beringer has achieved, Freya has been in a rather foul mood. The man rejected her all those years ago and took one of her Valkyries as his bride instead. I would be careful around her. She is quite envious of you. Brynhildr blushed when she heard this and averted her gaze. The idea that the queen of the Valkyries was jealous of one of her humble servants was simply unbelievable. But when she considered all the time she had spent with Beringer, Brynhildr began to understand the sentiment. In fact, with each passing day, Beringer came closer to death's door, though he likely had a few decades left to live. Brynhildr wanted to be the one to carry his soul to his personal afterlife. Until now, this had been assumed, but she felt compelled to request permission from the All-Father himself. Lord Odin, I was wondering if you might permit me a selfish request? Odin wiped his beard, which was dripping with mead, before granting her permission to speak her mind. Go ahead. What is it that you desire from me? Brynhildr lowered her head and fell to her knees, making a request she had pondered for some time. When Berenger finally passes from the mortal world, I wish to be the one to lead him to the afterlife. I know you and the gods have spent much time and effort to ensure a proper paradise for your champion and his loved ones. But as his wife, I feel the need to personally guide him on his journey. And if you permit it, to retire there with him for eternity. Odin's eyes narrowed as he heard this request. Brynhildr had served him for as long as he could remember, ferrying the valiant dead across the Rainbow Bridge and to Valhalla's gates. Yet now she was asking to set aside her duties to live a peaceful life with her lover for eternity. It was indeed a selfish request, but he could tell by the determined expression on her face that the only thing she now had on her mind was her family. Thus, the mighty deity sighed in defeat as he allowed Brynhildr this selfish request. Although I would be lost without you in my service, I can tell that you are serious about this, and I will have to find a proper replacement for you. Very well, go, my child, and be with the man you love. I free you from your responsibilities. Brynhildr's ice-blue eyes lit up in excitement and disbelief. At first, she thought she had heard incorrectly. But was she now free to be by Berenger's side, in this life and the next? Words could not express the joy she currently felt, and thus she fell to her knees and bowed her head to the floor as she thanked the powerful deity for his benevolence. Thank you. I do not know how I can ever repay you for this kindness. Odin simply grunted and dismissed the woman's claims before sending her on her way. You have already done enough. Go, child, and be free. With this said, Brynhildr flew out from Valhalla's gates and descended upon the mortal world, where she quickly found herself outside the door to her home. Most of her children with Berenger were adults and had gone on to support their elder brother in his pursuits as the King of Iceland. All she really needed to do was take the youngest of their brood and sail off to the Reich, where she hoped to be with Berenger until the day he finally passed from this mortal world. After packing her things and gathering her youngest children, Brynhildr took one last look at the village that had been her home for decades. Wearing a bitter smile, she set off on her journey to the Austrian village of Hallstatt, where her husband now rested in retirement. Berenger sat on the sandy beach of the lake, drinking from a bottle of beer. He was in a particularly good mood, enjoying the sight of his many wives and lovers playing volleyball in micro-bikinis. The way their curves moved as they played was an enticing sight indeed. However, as he was taking in a scene that could only be described as heavenly, he heard the voice of a woman he was not expecting to see for another few weeks. He quickly turned towards the source of the alluring voice and dropped his beer in the sand the moment he saw Brynhildr's divine figure. He had no idea what she was doing in the Reich, but he did not really care. Berenger ran towards his wife, lifted her in the air, and kissed her passionately. Just as he was about to ask what had happened, she smiled and informed him of the good news: I have been released from service to the gods. From this day until the end of time, I will be by your side, my love. Berenger was in complete disbelief at what he had just heard, but he was happy nonetheless. He kissed his wife again in front of their youngest children, but then noticed something terrifying. All 10 of his other women were gazing at him with a fury that only a scorned woman could muster. They realized that their man had over a dozen children with another woman. It was at that moment that Berenger realized he was well and truly in trouble. After all, he had completely failed to mention to his wives just how many children he and Brynhildr had together, something that would undoubtedly be a source of envy for them all, especially Linda. Berenger's elated smile immediately faded as he heard his wife's shrill voice call out to him. Without a doubt, the red-headed beauty was furious at the sight of over a dozen small children following their mother, who was an exquisite beauty in her own right. Berenger! Of course, Linda knew who this woman was, the Valkyrie Brynhildr, the mother of Siv. But she was unaware that her husband had been fathering children with Brynhildr for over 20 years. This was the one thing that infuriated her more than anything else, as she always prided herself on the balance that existed within her husband's harem. She herself had 5 children, as did all of her rivals, but now, suddenly, a woman had disrupted this balance of power. This not only enraged Linda but also all of his other wives and concubines, who glared at the platinum blonde and blue-eyed children with fury. Berenger led Brynhildr over to his other wives and introduced her properly, hoping they would be distracted by the Valkyrie's beauty. Ladies, this is my wife, Brynhildr. Though our marriage isn't recognized by men, the gods have deemed us indeed married. And these little tykes are some of our children. Linda's mouth fell open when she heard the word some, and she quickly demanded to know the actual number of children he had with the Valkyrie. All the while, Brynhildr wore an awkward smile and said nothing. Berenger, how many children do you have with this woman? Berenger honestly did not know the answer and looked over at Brynhildr, who seemed mildly disappointed but answered for him. Berenger and I have 26 children together so far. This news shocked all the women, who gazed upon the medal Brynhildr had received for siring so many offspring with awe and envy. After all, they all had 5 children, which meant they only qualified for the bronze tier of the Mother's Cross of Honor. Brynhildr's medal, however, was made of solid gold and encrusted with diamonds and enamel. It was the most envious Linda had ever felt in her life, and she was not the only one. Itami was also deeply aggrieved by this news. She quickly stepped forward and voiced her disbelief. 26. You have 26 children with this woman? How is that even possible? Did you start with her the moment she became fertile? Itami seemed unaware of Brynhildr's supernatural identity, and Berenger quickly explained her unique situation. No, AI, you misunderstand. Brynhildr is a Valkyrie. She is immortal and eternally fertile. When we met, she was already thousands of years old and looks the same now as she did then. Naturally, AI was aware that the gods existed in this world, as she had personally encountered them herself. She also knew that Berenger had a mistress in Iceland, but she had never been informed that this woman was practically a goddess in her own right. This naturally made Itami extremely angry at Berenger for keeping such a thing from her. She was quick to voice her frustration. You slept with what is essentially an angel, and didn't tell me? What else do I not know? Berenger felt extremely awkward under the angry stares and the shouts of his women, who immediately began to bicker among themselves about who was truly his favorite. Big brother, I thought you loved me the most. This comment by Henrietta immediately caused Linda to flash her sky-blue eyes at the woman. She quickly scoffed and expressed her dissatisfaction with Henrietta's words. Oh, please. Everybody knows that I am Berenger's number one, and always have been. I compromised by having 5 children to keep the rest of you happy, but this bastard went out of his way to have 26 children without even letting me know. Words cannot express how pissed I am. Yasmin immediately butted into the conversation and staked her claim. You're his number one? Funny, I remember you being threatened by my position and learning how to cook only because our husband treasured my abilities as a wife beyond yours. Berenger immediately realized that this sudden revelation threatened to bring down the harmonious harem he had painstakingly built over the last 30+ years. He quickly shouted at the top of his lungs to get them to cease their bickering. Oi! Be quiet. All of you. I have something to say. The women immediately ceased their bickering and did as they were told. Decades of conditioning had led them to behave around their husband when he raised his voice, and Linda was no exception. Berenger then looked at all of his wives and lovers with a bit of pity in his eyes before explaining his reasoning. You are all mortal women, and as each of you should be aware by now, the chances of a fatality occurring when giving birth drastically increase after the 4th child. And I could not bear the thought of losing any of you, so I limited the number of children we could have together to 5 per woman. But Brynhildr is immortal, it's impossible for her to die. She is practically a spirit in corporeal form. We decided not to use protection and to roll the dice. And thus, we have the large family you are gazing upon. I never brought this up because I knew it would have this effect on you all. Now you're all trying to compete for first place? Hasn't this already been settled? You are all my favorites. I value you all equally, and though this hasn't always been the case, it certainly is now. So, quit your bickering and accept reality for what it is. Maybe if you were all immortal avenging angels like Brynhildr, we'd have 100 kids together, but that is not the reality we live in. So, I don't want to hear another thing about it. Now, accept your new sister properly, before I get angry. Berenger then grabbed hold of Brynhildr's hand and kissed her in front of his other wives and lovers. His speech had a significant impact on their minds. After all, Berengar had never admitted that he had learned to love all his women equally over the past few decades. Luckily, he had chosen to save that card for a time when it was needed, and these words seemed to cause all the women to blush in embarrassment. Although Linda was still bitter about not having as many children as Brynhildr, she understood Berengar's reasoning after some time to think. She sighed, then approached the man and hugged him. One by one, his other 10 women began to do the same, approaching Berengar and hugging him, accepting this new reality that was suddenly forced upon them. And once they were all together, Berengar finally smiled and said the words that forced all the women to forgive him. You know what this means, though? You all now have another dozen kids to raise. After all, my kids are all of our kids. Isn't that the way it has always been? The sudden realization that they could all be doting mothers to a bunch of little kids again, even in their old age, kicked the maternal instincts of Berengar's harem into overdrive. They quickly forgave their husband and fawned over all his kids with Brynhildr. This surprised the beautiful Valkyrie, who thought she might need to keep her kids away from Berengar's other women. With this, Berengar brought the kids into his beachside villa and began raising an entirely new generation of his offspring as their father. He and Brynhildr continued to reproduce until the man was on his deathbed. By then, there would be several dozen demigod-like beings running around Germany, many of whom would go on to make a name for themselves as some of the Reich's most promising talents, even more so than Berengar's first generation of children, whom he had with his 5 wives. It has been decades since the de Valois dynasty was executed, and the Kingdom of France was partially annexed as the Dominion of Frankia. During this time, the German Reich has invested an enormous amount of effort and resources into converting the local population into Germans. By now, many German men have moved to Frankia, married French wives, and introduced their culture and customs to the French people. After nearly 30 years of this process of Germanization, the Kingdom of France and French culture are nearly dead. What remains is a strictly German populace, speaking the German language and partaking in German customs. Because of this, Hans now stands in the city of Paris, raising the flag of the German Empire over the old castle where the previous ruling dynasty lived. It has been decades since Aubry and his siblings were executed, and by now, the name King Aubry de Valois is spoken only with disgust by the Frankish people. This dark chapter in Frankia's history, when they were ruled by the degenerates of a foreign culture, is what the German propaganda machine has ingrained in the youngest generation. Hans stands among a crowd no different from those within the fatherland. He stands on a podium with a wide smile, announcing the deconstruction of the border defenses between the German Reich and the Dominion of Frankia. When this wall falls, it will symbolize that the Franks are truly German once more. Decades ago, my father came to this land, not as a foreign conqueror, but as a friend to the good people of Frankia. He supported the rebellion of the masses against a corrupt regime ruled by a house of degenerates. I need not recount what transpired within the halls of this castle, but many of you know the truth. In the time since, Germany has done everything it could to help rebuild this mighty kingdom and restore the legacy of your ancestors, who share the same blood as my people. After 30 years of this process, I can proudly say that the day has finally come for the wall that stands between us to be dismantled. Over the coming weeks, my corps of engineers will dismantle the wall, remove the barbed wire, and clear the landmines that have plagued our borders for years. Though such measures may have been necessary several decades ago, when the possibility of war between our two peoples was very real, today they only serve to keep a united people apart. I am also announcing today that I will be opening the borders. Furthermore, I declare that the full annexation of the Dominion of Frankia is now complete. From now on, Frankish territory will be divided into a series of small duchies, counties, and principalities, much like the fatherland. We will invest in the reconstruction of Frankish infrastructure so that it reaches a level comparable to that of the fatherland and the rest of the German Reich. I believe you will all enjoy the many benefits that come with this transformation, which will take another 5 to 10 years to complete. Thank you all for coming here today. To show my appreciation for your years of effort, I will be throwing a massive feast for the entire city of Paris to enjoy. You have all earned at least this much. The crowd that had gathered erupted into wild applause for the German Kaiser and the promises he had made that day. No doubt, turning France from a society at the pinnacle of pre-industrial technology into a modern state with technology on par with the early 21st century would be a massive undertaking. However, it was a necessary measure that the German crown had long prepared to make, even before Hans' ascension to the throne. The German Kaiser enjoyed a feast with his new people before departing back to Kufstein, which had become the center of the world. Once within the thriving mountain metropolis, Hans returned to his family's home, where he was greeted by his 5 wives and many children. Since taking his father's advice several years ago to work less and spend more time with his family, the rift that had formed between his children began to mend. Currently, Hans' eldest sons were no longer on the verge of potentially killing one another and had instead begun to compete in a more friendly manner. With France's Germanization completed, Hans had achieved what his father had set out to do decades prior. This, along with the former Kingdom of Bohemia, were 2 regions fully Germanized due to Berenger's interference in the timeline. However, these were not the only places on Hans' radar. Poland would be the next to lose its distinctive culture, language, and ethnicity, followed by the Rus and the Baltic. This would create a Germany spanning most of Europe. After stepping into his palace, Hans immediately changed out of his ceremonial attire and dressed in something more comfortable before joining his family at the dinner table, where they were waiting with a substantial meal. The house cooks had gone out of their way to prepare a feast to celebrate the big occasion, though they were unaware that Hans had already eaten while in Frankia. However, for the sake of entertaining his family and ensuring their hard work did not go to waste, he decided to sit down and have a small bite, along with a flagon of lager. There was a particularly warm smile on Veronica's face as she asked her husband how his day was. "So, how did it go? Did the people of Frankia rejoice at this day of unification?" If there was anyone akin to Linda among Hans' harem, it would be Veronica, who had been practically raised by the red-headed temptress since a young age, to be her successor. Even so, Veronica did not actually succeed Linda as the director of intelligence. Instead, she spent her entire day looking after her exceptionally large family. Thus, she was naturally unaware of the celebration happening across the border. Hans gazed at his loving wife and matched her smile with one of his own. He nodded his head before confirming that indeed the people of Frankia were content with the new order. Of course, they were practically weeping with joy as I announced that the border would soon be opened and that we would be investing in the modernization of their lands. It's honestly hard to believe that most of the world still lives such a primitive lifestyle. It was like stepping into a time machine and going back to my early childhood, when the only lands my father controlled were the county of Tyrol. Sometimes it's hard to believe all that has been accomplished in such a short time. The fact that we are now repeating this venture in Frankia is interesting, to say the least. But I suppose we have gained enough experience in construction to finish modernizing the region within a decade rather than the 4 it took to build Germany into what it is today. But enough about me. How was your day? Veronica smiled and began to explain how her day was, followed by Anne, Noemi, Natalia, and finally Claudia. They all shared the details of their day, along with those of their children. Hans, the most powerful man in the world, took the time to speak with each member of his large family about their lives. In this regard, he had certainly surpassed his father, who spent most of his children's early years either at war or in his office. It was only later, when they were teenagers, that Berenger made any real effort to get to know most of his children. Because of this, he had several favorites. However, Hans did not have this mentality. He loved all of his wives and children equally and ensured he was a part of each and every one of their lives. All while working 6 to 8 hours a day to run the world's largest and most powerful empire. As the Reich continued to develop and Hans's reign persisted, years passed, and for a while, the world remained mostly peaceful. United under the prodigal scions of Berenger, most of the world's leaders were slow to anger and more tolerant of offenses. However, as time passed, one region, in particular, became a point of dispute between 2 major powers. The Crimean Khanate had extended to the borders of Mongolia and shared its borders with several major powers. Although they had spent the last decade or so trying to establish a proper and modern nation-state, they were, in many ways, behind those who had started earlier. For instance, the Indian Empire had entered the age of steam power. This was not exactly difficult for them to achieve after reaching a peak pre-industrial society, and with his father's blessing, Arun, along with many of his peers, entered the age of industry. As a result, many weapons were now being domestically manufactured, supplementing the German firearms that had been purchased in bulk for the last few decades. These domestically produced firearms were less advanced, using black powder and simpler repeating designs, but they were advanced enough for the task and could be locally produced. This meant that India's reliance on Germany for military matters was beginning to wane. India's growing industry naturally put them at odds with the Crimean Khanate, which sought to expand into Tibet, a region that had previously been a tributary to the Ming dynasty. However, it had been many years since the Ming Civil War began, and there were no signs of it ending. Millions had already perished, and undoubtedly, millions more would die in the future. Amid this chaos, two emperors began eyeing Tibet as the next piece of their realms. Emperor Arun of the Indian Empire had long desired to expand into the region but had faced hostility from his younger brother, Altan, who also coveted the land. After all, it would allow Altan to access many precious minerals that could fuel his own industry when his people began producing machines. Currently, two armies faced each other at the borders of Tibet. On one side was the great horde of the Crimean Khanate, and on the other, the Indian army. Both were well armed and ready to fight for this land. Altan knew that Arun would be a formidable opponent compared to those he had previously faced. The Indian army was organized and modeled after the pre-mechanized and pre-aerial warfare standards of Germany. In contrast, the Great Horde was still primarily based on cavalry, tachankas, and mobility. If war were to break out, Altan realized he could not lead his troops as he had in the past. The Indians were skilled in the effective use of their artillery, and leading a charge would be suicidal. Nonetheless, both Altan and Arun had arrived to command their armies in this dispute. The two half-brothers gazed at each other through their binoculars, each waiting for the other to raise a white flag and initiate negotiations. Neither, however, was willing to make the first move. Thus, they stood in the snowy mountains, dressed warmly against the cold, icy winds of Tibet. The standoff lasted for 3 days. On the 4th day, something unusual happened. Both men received phone calls within minutes of each other. After all, Hans had left satellite phones with his brothers so that if he ever needed to contact them, he could. Clearly, German intelligence had been alerted to the standoff between the Indian army and the Crimean horde, which forced Hans to intervene. The call was a single, straightforward message from Hans before he hung up and dialed the other line. "Lay down your arms and come to Kufstein so we can negotiate this peacefully, or I swear to the gods I will annihilate both of your armies." Knowing that Hans would follow through on this threat, the orders to withdraw from the region were given to both armies, and they left Tibet without firing a single shot. Arun and Altan both arrived in Kufstein and were treated as esteemed guests of the German Reich. It had been a long time since either of the two half-brothers had been there. Arun had the luxury of growing up in Kufstein during his formative years and later moved to India to replace his uncle as its emperor. In contrast, Altan was born and raised in Crimea. As a result, the two men had very different feelings about their father or the von Kufstein family in general. This was evident in the way Arun greeted Hans with a hug, as if the two men were truly brothers, while Altan simply shook the Kaiser's hand with a rather stoic expression. Hans smiled as he asked the two emperors to enter his home. He was clearly excited to see Arun. "Please come in, brothers. It has been too long since the three of us have gathered. And I fear the reason for your visits is not the kindest of circumstances. Nonetheless, I know we can put our differences aside and come to an understanding that each of us will accept." Altan simply scoffed at this remark, causing Arun to frown and shake his head. Clearly, Arun believed his half-brother should have more respect for his siblings. However, this did not seem to bother Hans, who led the men into his office, where a servant quickly served tea and snacks. Once the servant had left the room, Hans finally brought up the dispute that had brought his two half-brothers to his house. "I understand that you both want Tibet for similar reasons. And although the Ming dynasty may be in a civil war, we must also take them into account during this discussion. Our father has always shown the Ming a certain degree of respect, and he would not want any of his sons to violate the treaties he established with them. So, what I am about to propose is something I believe will satisfy all three parties involved in this dispute." Altan stared at Hans in disbelief. It was unreasonable to give the Ming anything when they were in a state of civil war. To hell with what Brimir had promised. This was a matter of securing land and resources while the iron was hot, and he was quick to voice this sentiment. "You want me to abandon my claims in favor of the Ming dynasty?" What nonsense is this? I have the right of conquest to take what is available. To hell with the promises our father has made. Since when did Crimea agree to such nonsense? Both Arun and Hans frowned when they heard these words of hostility from their brother's mouth. Just as the Indian emperor was about to speak up in Hans's defense, the man raised his hand and voiced his offer. Whether you agree or not, a promise was made by the Reich that the Ming dynasty will remain independent and in control of their own sphere of influence. This is a promise I will not go back on. So, as I see it, until this civil war is over, both of you can operate your mining corporations in Tibet. There are more than enough resources for both of you. However, once this civil war ends, Tibet will re-enter the Ming sphere of influence. That is, assuming the Ming dynasty emerges victorious and not one of the pretenders who seeks to claim the throne for themselves. If that were to happen, we would have to renegotiate this deal, as I would not recognize the legitimacy of the warlords and rebels who each claim to be the next emperor. So, do we have a deal? Upon seeing the stern resolve in his brother's eyes, Alton knew he would not be able to get his way. After all, might makes right, and while the rest of the world had only just begun to enter the age of industry, the Germans were already sending men into space. Soon enough, they would operate on other worlds beyond Earth. Faced with this overwhelming power, Alton had no choice but to humble himself before the Kaiser. Thus, he sighed heavily before agreeing to Hans's proposal. Naturally, Arun did the same, and thus Hans ended the war for Tibet before it had truly begun. Brimir sat in the living room of his lakeside villa, a beer in his hand. So far, retirement had been a nice change of pace, even if he was now the father to a dozen or more little ones from Brynhilde's litter. However, today was a day for him to sit back and relax, and that was exactly what he was doing as he flipped through the channels on his 80-inch LED 8K TV. By now, the Reich had progressed to a level of technology roughly the same as the world he left behind. But in many ways, especially in terms of space technology, it was even more advanced. For example, at that very moment, Brimir stopped on a news channel displaying something incredible. The headline was bold, big, and so shocking that Brimir nearly dropped his beer. He shouted across the house in the loudest voice he could muster, "Everyone get in here, now!" At first, his family thought the head of their household was angry, and they immediately dropped what they were doing, running into the room with anxious expressions. Instead, they saw the man smiling and repeating a single phrase over and over, as if it were a mantra of faith. "She did it. I can't believe she actually did it." On the screen of the television was an exceptionally large rocket, currently being boarded by several astronauts. These men would boldly be taking a journey in space farther than anything humanity had ever achieved before, whether in this life or his last one. The words on the screen explained Brimir's sudden shout to his entire family: "Man mission to Mars underway." Yasmin was as shocked as Brimir. For years, she had watched her eldest daughter go out of her way to study space and rockets. In fact, the German space industry was as advanced as it is today, largely due to her efforts in the field. The last time Brimir saw one of Zara's rockets, it was a prototype for a nuclear fission propulsion rocket. It detonated just below the atmosphere, a disaster Brimir was immediately forced to mitigate. However, it now seemed that in the years since, Zara had finally perfected her project. The Reich was making its first attempt to send men to Mars, a daring bid in space exploration that hadn't even occurred by the time Brimir had died in Afghanistan during his past life. To Brimir, this was truly unthinkable, and yet it was clearly displayed before him. He honestly didn't know how to feel as his family found their seats on the sofa, chairs, and love seats. Some of them even lay down on the carpet with eager looks in their eyes. Yasmin, the mother of the woman responsible for this project, sat directly by Brimir's side and held his hand. Brimir immediately felt her tremble, clearly anxious about her daughter's potential success and the odds of failure. To comfort her, Brimir wrapped his arm around her and kissed her on the neck. This caused her to snort in exhaustion and push him away. "Not now. Look, they're about to begin the countdown." The entire Reich, now spanning the globe, sat in front of their TVs, computers, smartphones, tablets, and more, eagerly waiting for the 10-second countdown to begin. Everyone was at the edge of their seats as it finally started. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Immediately after this word was spoken aloud, the rocket ignited and began to slowly ascend. Brimir could feel his heart stop for a brief second as he gazed upon the massive rocket flying further and further into the sky. He counted the distance it made as it slowly escaped Earth's bonds and entered space. The words of his most beloved daughter, now the head of the German space program, resounded across the entirety of the Reich. Brimir could hear the tears of joy in her voice as she spoke, "We have liftoff." Brimir and all of his wives immediately jumped out of their seats and began to applaud and scream toward the television. The youngest members of their family gazed upon them with confusion and a bit of fear, not understanding the significance of this moment. But Brimir understood it better than anyone. The dawn of the space age had finally arrived. Soon, the German Reich would expand to the rest of the solar system, filled with nearly unlimited resources. Yasmin was not exactly the most educated woman. She had grown up in a medieval society and had not really kept up with her studies over the years, preferring to perform the role of a doting mother and loving housewife. So, she quickly asked her husband, whom she knew was much more knowledgeable on the subject, about the question that currently puzzled her. "Husband, how long will it take for the rocket to reach Mars? It took 3 days to get to the moon, so this will be longer, right?" However, the bronze-skinned beauty was stunned when Brimir shook his head and explained in layman's terms the reality of the current situation. "Not at all. That was much older technology than what we are seeing now. With the current engines this rocket uses, it will be only about 2 days before our brave astronauts land on Mars. I can't believe it. It's finally happened, and all it took was 2 lifetimes." Brimir struggled to keep himself from crying at this moment. He had never seen anything so nerve-wracking, something so unknown to him. Throughout his life in this world, he had fought tooth and nail to create a thriving society, one he never expected to catch up technologically with the one he had left behind. But today, that limit had finally been surpassed. This was the first step beyond the technology he knew and understood. From this day forward, Brimir's knowledge was now officially obsolete. For a man who had turned a fractured medieval state into a modern global empire, this was truly a monumental occasion, one Brimir thought perhaps he was merely dreaming about. But Linda's voice shook him back to reality, as she came to a sudden realization, which she quickly voiced aloud. "Are you telling me that during your past life, your people never reached Mars?" Brimir immediately shook his head, clearing up the misunderstanding with a particularly proud tone in his trembling voice. "No. That's not entirely correct. You see, we had sent unmanned drones to Mars for decades by the time I died, well before I was born, actually. But we had never sent a man to Mars. In fact, it was projected to happen decades after I passed away. The world had largely given up on space after we got to the moon, and we actually regressed in this field in many ways. It was only around the time I died that there was any significant interest in revitalizing our space program, and by then it had mostly been handed over to the private sector. It's honestly astonishing to see this happen. Almost as if the goal of humanity in 2 of my lifetimes has finally been achieved. But it's honestly still too early to celebrate. Any number of things could go wrong now that they are in space. We will simply have to cross our fingers and pray that the astronauts make it safely to Mars and back." Linda felt she had learned something interesting about her man's past. After all, he rarely spoke about his life in that world. But she finally understood. In half a century, Brimir had created a society capable of surpassing the one he had come from, perhaps the most monumental achievement any man had ever made in history, one that might never be surpassed. Brimir and his family celebrated the Reich's first official attempt to land on Mars with a manned mission. However, they held off from fully enjoying the moment until 2 days later, when the mission's success or failure would be determined. Once more, Brimir and his family gathered near the television to watch the footage of the rocket and its crew getting ever closer to Mars. Each passing moment was one of intense anxiety, especially for the man the Reich still called the Great Kaiser. Despite the many years that had passed, Brimir had personally overseen the creation of the German space program and continued to fund its development throughout his reign. Evidently, his successor agreed with these actions, as Hans ensured that the space program received everything it needed to succeed. In Berenger's lap was a giant bowl of buttered popcorn, and in his free hand, a beer. He could not take his eyes off the broadcast, which depicted mankind's first attempt to put a man on Mars. Slowly but surely, the rocket approached its destination, and the landing pod detached, beginning its descent towards the surface of the red planet. Berenger could not help but feel as if he were about to have a heart attack, as the time it took for the landing module to touch down seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Finally, the Mars landing was completed, and an astronaut, bearing the surname von Kaufstein, stepped out of the landing pod and placed his foot on the surface of the red world. Berenger forgot the bowl of popcorn in his lap and jumped up, shouting in an overly excited voice, complimenting his people on achieving a dream that had spanned 2 lifetimes. Glory to the Reich! Glory to Germany! The popcorn that had spilled all over the floor landed on the backs of several of Berenger's children, but even then they did not seem to care. Instead, they were quick to jump to their feet and dance around in joy at the sight of this monumental occasion. Mankind had now taken its first step on Mars, and that was something to celebrate. The recording contained the voice of one of Berenger's youngest sons, who was the man who had stepped foot on Mars before all others. For Kaiser and Fatherland. After saying this, the man placed the banner of the German Empire on the red world's surface while looking around at the barren wasteland with pride. This world contained innumerable resources that the Reich could now take advantage of. Mars officially belonged to the Reich. A new world to settle, a new world to conquer, a new world to call home. For the first time in Berenger's 2 lifetimes, humanity now had 2 worlds to call home. Though it would take a few more decades to establish a permanent presence on the red world, as humanity had begun to do on the moon, Berenger knew that by the time he drew his last breath, this dream would be realized. Words could not express the excitement Berenger felt in his heart at this moment. And he was not the only one. His more educated wives and concubines knew exactly what this meant for the German race. They had conquered Earth and Mars, and next would be the rest of the solar system. Perhaps in a few hundred years, humanity would have a second star to call their own. It was truly impossible to know how long it would take to accomplish such a thing. But regardless, humanity, or more specifically Germany, was now an interplanetary state. Something which Berenger and Linda both found to be truly unbelievable. However, before the red-headed beauty could properly react, Berenger reached for his cell phone and dialed a number that few men in this world had access to. Immediately, the sound of his eldest son's voice appeared on the other end, filled with joy. Before Hans could speak, Berenger congratulated his son with a voice brimming with pride. "Congratulations, Hans. You have accomplished something extraordinary today, something humanity will remember until the end of our race." Hans smiled when he heard this, even though his father could not see it. He then spoke in a tone filled with admiration for the man who made this all possible. "Me? Seriously? You're giving me credit for this? Even I am not that shameless. I merely continued the policies you put in place. This achievement is the result of one man's efforts, yours, father. Sure, Zara may have built the rocket that sent our men to Mars, but she never would have been able to do such a thing if you hadn't educated her about science and physics. Something, which both you and I know, did not exist until you came into this world. I should be the one congratulating you. In fact, I have a question I wish to ask, if you don't mind answering it?" Berenger simply smiled and nodded, giving his permission. "Go ahead, Hans. Ask me anything. I am in a good enough mood that I will answer any question you have." These were the exact words Hans wanted to hear, and his voice became rather meek, as if he were suddenly not confident in himself as he asked a question he had been meaning to speak about for quite some time. "So, tell me, father, have we finally done it? Have we surpassed the world you came from?" A proud smile emerged on Berenger's face as he nodded once more and answered his son's question with an even prouder tone of voice. "Indeed, we have. When I first came into this world, I never thought such a thing would be possible. But today we have taken the first step beyond the world I came from. I believe the Reich has a bright future ahead, and as long as the von Kaufstein dynasty remains in power, our empire will last. Thank you, Hans, for showing me something I never thought I would witness with my own eyes." However, Hans' words shocked Berenger, as he did not expect them to come from his proud and stubborn son. No, father, it is I who should be thanking you for creating a world where this is even possible. Enjoy your retirement, you have more than earned it. You can rest easy knowing that the Reich is in good hands. Unfortunately, I'm getting a call from Zara, so I need to go. But we will speak again soon. Goodbye for now, and have a good evening. Oh, and do be sure to give mother my love. After saying this, Hans hung up. Berenger saw the anxious expression on Linda's face, who was eager to know what her son had said. She quickly voiced her curiosity. Well, what did he say? Berenger chuckled as he recalled the conversation he had just had with his son, then informed his wife of what their boy had said. He said the credit for this triumph of humanity goes to me, and that he wanted to thank me for creating a world where it was possible. Oh, and he also wishes to express his love for his mother. Linda smiled and hugged her husband, nuzzling her head into his broad chest. She spoke quickly about their eldest son. Our baby boy is all grown up now, isn't he? Berenger chuckled at this absurd statement while stroking his wife's silky red hair. You're just noticing this now? This made Linda pout and fall silent. To her, Hans would always be her precious baby boy, her firstborn child, the boy she had raised to be an emperor. How could she possibly view him as a man? For the rest of the evening, Berenger spent time with his wives and concubines, as well as the many children he had with Brynhilde. After throwing a massive celebration for this triumph of humanity, Berenger retired to his bedchambers with his 11 women by his side. There, they had a grand orgy before falling asleep in each other's arms. Standing in the garden outside the lakeside villa that was Berenger's new home were two of his wives. It had been many years since Honoria first came to the Reich, seeking a life away from her father's control. When she left at just 16 years old, she had no idea that she would find not one but two lovers. One was her husband, Berenger, and the other was the man's second wife, Linda. Over the years, Linda and Honoria's relationship had grown from casual experimentation while their man was away at war to a deep and intimate love. In many ways, it resembled the love the two women shared with their husband. While Berenger was spending some alone time with his first wife, Adela, Linda and Honoria were standing together in the garden, hugging each other and kissing passionately. Only in their own home could they show their true feelings for one another, for homosexuality, even among women, was deeply frowned upon by German society. There was a rather anxious look in Honoria's eyes, as if being intruded upon in this very moment by one of the villa's staff could thoroughly ruin their reputation. Yet, there was a deep sense of longing as she posed a single question to her other lover. Honey, do you really think it's a good idea for the two of us to be out here in the garden? Linda did not immediately respond to Honoria's question, at least not with words. Instead, she moved her hands deep into Honoria's panties, grabbed hold of the woman's soft and voluptuous bottom, and lifted her into the air, kissing her on the lips once more. She then moved her lips toward Honoria's neck, marking the woman as her own with a hickey, before moving further down to Honoria's large bosom. It was only then that the two were interrupted by an old friend. Heraclius, the pet eagle of Honoria, landed on Linda's shoulder and squawked. The intelligent glint in his eyes showed that he knew who was in charge. Linda simply scoffed before commenting on the bird's unnatural intelligence. Rhea, dear, have you ever wondered why Heraclius and his brood are so intelligent and long-lived? By now, Heraclius was reaching his 50s, which, even for an Eastern imperial eagle, was a remarkable lifespan. In truth, Honoria had never really thought about this question, and thus, she simply giggled as she made a slight jest, which might very well be reality. Perhaps he's descended from a god's familiar? This would not be the first hyper-intelligent animal that the couple had come across. In fact, there was a pack of leopards living in the massive gardens of the Kufstein royal palace, all descended from an African goddess's familiar. Because of this, the idea that Heraclius was of a similar origin made a lot of sense. Evidently, the bird did not seem to acknowledge the statement. Perhaps he did not know his origin, or perhaps he was being a little shit and would not reveal this secret even if asked. Either one was possible. After Heraclius took flight once more, Linda led Honoria over to a park bench, where she sat down and lowered the Byzantine princess into her lap. The golden lockets that both women wore, shaped like hearts and containing pictures of each other and their husband, swayed past their necks as they did so. Silence prevailed between the two women as they affectionately rubbed noses while gazing lovingly into each other's eyes, then began kissing on the bench. Before Linda stroked her hand through Honoria's chocolate hair, there was a slight pause. Then, Linda made a request, one she knew her husband would approve of. "Ria, why don't you dye your hair purple again? It's been many years since I last saw you with such a striking color, and I know Beringer would also be interested in witnessing its splendor once more." Honoria blushed at the thought. It had been many years since she had dyed her hair a deep Tyrian purple, and during those days, she was the most fearsome pirate queen this world had ever seen. It was an expression of her youth and her desire to be free. But she was no longer that young girl who wanted to sail the seven seas. In fact, it had been many years since she thought about the girl she had sailed with or where they were now. To her, that was a page in her past, one she remembered fondly but did not want to relive. "I'm sorry, dear, but those days are behind me. Besides, if an old woman like myself were to dye her hair purple, it would be nothing short of comical." Despite both women being in their mid to late 50s, neither of them looked their age. They looked at least a decade younger, and Linda did not take the term old woman kindly. Instead, she placed one finger on her lover's luscious lips and demanded she dye her hair back to purple. "Never call yourself old, my love. No matter what your age is, you will always be the most beautiful woman to me. Won't you please dye your hair this one last time?" Seeing that Linda was practically begging, Honoria finally relented and agreed to dye her hair purple once more. Albeit in a rather meek and timid manner. "All right, dear. If that is what you desire." After saying this, the two women began to softly kiss once more, while the autumn leaves of the nearby tree fell upon them. In another part of the town of Hallstatt, Beringer was having lunch at a quaint restaurant with his wife, Adela. Although the two of them had their differences over the years, whatever resentments they had toward each other in the past were now dead and buried. Instead, Beringer treated Adela with the love and dignity she deserved. Because of this, he often took her out on dates, like today. The restaurant they were sitting in was Italian-themed, owned by an Italian chef who had traveled to Austria to spread the cuisine of his homeland. Naturally, Beringer had a hand in the creation of this cuisine, which would not normally exist in this world for several hundred years. But no one but himself knew about that. Instead, he ate a bowl of baked ziti, while Adela enjoyed a plate of chicken Alfredo. The smile on her pretty face was truly endearing to the man, as he reminisced about their first date together, which seemed like a lifetime ago. Something he was quick to discuss. "You remember all those years ago, when you first visited my home, and I took you out for sandwiches? Gods, it feels so long ago." Adela simply smiled as she swallowed the noodles in her mouth, washing them down with a glass of white wine before responding to her husband's words. "It was so long ago, practically a lifetime ago. Do you know I was extremely angry that we were betrothed back then? I had always heard from my brothers that you were this sickly man, who might die at any moment. One with a particularly bad attitude and a love of wine. But the moment I laid eyes on you, I knew that everything I had been told about you was nothing but lies, because you were my Prince Charming, my fiancé, the one I would marry and have a family with." Beringer chuckled when he heard this, then responded to Adela's claim with the truth, something she had long known, but he felt the need to say nonetheless. "Well, I dare say they weren't exactly lies. Before I gained the memories of my other self, I was an utter wastrel, entirely undeserving of your lovely hand. No man can live his life without regrets, and though I have many, none greater than the way I treated you during the first part of our betrothal and marriage. I know I've apologized before, and I won't do so again, but I am glad that you are my wife, Adela." Adela blushed at these words, but blushed even more when Beringer leaned across the table and gave her a gentle peck on the lips. Despite everything they had been through over the years, she still loved the man more than anything. Thus, another day of retirement went by, with Beringer pleasing his wives and taking care of the many children he had with Adela. Today, however, was Adela's day, and he would make sure to spend the entire day with her alone. Today was a day like any other. As the years passed by and Beringer grew older, his children's families started to age as well. By now, Helga had a large family of her own and decided to spend the weekend with her parents at their lakeside estate. Hallstatt was a secluded town with little living space, but it was a beautiful town nonetheless. It was almost like a dream retirement spot for many people. While Helga and her husband were speaking with her parents, two of her children had secretly wandered off through the town to see what life in such a quiet and quaint place was really like. Helga's eldest son, a boy in his early teenage years, looked very much like her uncle Hans did when he was the boy's age. In fact, he had been named after Hans, and because of this, he walked around with pride. Since Berenger's retirement, Kaiser Hans von Kufstein had worked tirelessly for the Reich to maintain its position as a global powerhouse while expanding its borders and wealth. He was almost as popular among the German people as Berenger had been. Little Hans took pride in this. He was currently walking around the town of Hallstatt with one of his younger sisters by his side. The girl, roughly 12 years old, was as adorable as Helga had been at her age. Her name was Gertrude, and she was one of Linda's favorite grandchildren. However, while little Hans was haggling with a street merchant for a souvenir, the young girl got distracted by a beautiful bird and wandered off from the safety of her brother's protection. Eventually, she found herself alone in the streets, where three old men were sitting on the sidewalk, getting drunk. They had no idea that the little red-headed girl was a member of the esteemed von Kufstein dynasty, but these were men who had grown up in the medieval age, where a 12-year-old girl was considered an adult. Thus, they approached Gertrude while intoxicated, seeing if they could take advantage of the gorgeous young girl, who was all alone. The moment Gertrude saw the lecherous looks on the old drunks' faces, she began to panic and quickly ran away. Unfortunately for her, her long dress made this very difficult. Of course, the men chased after her, and she began to scream for her brother. But he was nowhere to be found. Hans! Hans! Help me! Somebody, help me! Unfortunately, nobody was nearby to save Gertrude, or so it appeared. Because of this, the men quickly tackled her to the ground, pulling at her dress all the while shushing her screams. Shush, girl, don't be so loud, or we won't be gentle. You really have wandered into the wrong part of town. It's almost as if you were asking for this. Just as the men were about to tear off Gertrude's dress, a loud gunshot rang in the air, spooking the men to their feet. Little Hans stood no more than 5 meters away, his hand raised in the air, holding a handgun. He then pointed his weapon at the three old men, who nearly wet their pants when they saw this. However, rather than immediately killing the men, little Hans's hands were shaking. He was a 14-year-old boy who had been raised in an era of peace and had never killed anyone before. Despite the fear on his face, Hans did not hesitate to fire a second shot, which hit one of the men in the shoulder. The moment this happened, the other two men grabbed their wounded friend and ran off, leaving Hans and Gertrude in a state of bewilderment. It took Hans several seconds to realize he should look after his little sister, and when he did, he immediately helped her back to the estate. Unbeknownst to the three would-be rapists, they had just incurred the wrath of a sleeping giant. After returning to the villa where their family was staying, Berenger and Linda were horrified to hear that their granddaughter had experienced something so traumatic. While the girl's mother and father began to comfort her, Eric took his wife aside and said something to her with a murderous glint in his eyes. I want these men to disappear, along with their families. Do you understand me? A sadistic smirk appeared on Linda's lips as she responded to her husband as if his request was the most obvious thing on the planet. Don't worry, dear. I will make sure their entire bloodline is punished for this offense. After saying this, Linda walked away and made one phone call. The new director of Imperial Intelligence was immediately shocked to hear Linda's voice on the phone. But after hearing about what had happened to Gertrude, she narrowed her eyes with a chilling gaze and responded with one simple sentence. It will be done. The web of German Imperial Intelligence spread across the entire world, and there was nothing that happened in this world that they did not know about. Because of this, they were quick to find out the identities of the men who had attacked the young princess. Immediately, the agents of Imperial Intelligence were dispatched across the fatherland to arrest the perpetrators and drag their families off for immediate execution. Berenger and Linda did not mess around when it came to avenging their family. An attack on one of them was an attack on all of them. Only the families of those responsible could possibly satisfy this desire for blood. Even if the public were to find out what had happened, they would agree with the Reich's decision to punish the entire bloodline. The von Kufsteins had the blood of a living saint residing within them, making them nearly the equivalent of gods in the flesh. To tarnish such divine beings with such sinful actions meant that blood needed to be spilled. The lives of the 3 men responsible were not nearly enough to appease the gods or their wrath. Of course, imperial intelligence was very discreet, rounding up the members of the perpetrators' families one by one, over time, and during the dead of night, to avoid making national headlines about a matter the von Kufstein family wanted to keep private. In the end, a total of 76 lives were lost as a result of the 3 old lechers' actions. The youngest was a boy roughly the age of little Hans. While this final act of fury by Berenger and his Spider Queen went entirely unnoticed by the public, it served as a reminder to those who knew about it that the von Kufstein family reigned supreme within the Reich. If you dared lay a hand on one of them, it would not only be your head that rolled. A lesson many had seemed to have forgotten during this age of relative peace. After all, it had been many years since Berenger burned Algeria to ash in retaliation for a man daring to strike his favorite daughter. If these old lechers had been foreign monarchs, their realms would have suffered a similar fate. For well over a decade, perhaps even 2, the Ming dynasty had been embroiled in a civil war. Throughout this time, the Reich had been funding and supplying the loyalist faction with the tools they needed to triumph. However, due to infighting and corruption, this support was not always effective. The Ming dynasty suffered repeated setbacks, and several emperors met untimely deaths. Now, only a distant relative of the once mighty Emperor Zhu Wudi sat on the throne, a young boy no older than 8. Perhaps due to the wisdom of his advisors or his own intelligence beyond his years, Zhufeng decided to accept international aid in this conflict and turn to his longtime allies, the Joseon dynasty, for their military prowess. Joseon troops flooded into war-torn Ming China and quelled the rebellious faction with their superior arms, most of which had been purchased from the Reich. The various warlords and challengers to the throne were apprehended and now knelt in Beijing, awaiting the emperor's judgment. Feng gazed at the men who had caused his empire to bleed, his youthful, beady eyes filled with sheer scorn. Narrowing his brows, he issued the decree that would end the civil war once and for all. Today, I, Emperor Zhufeng, chosen by the heavens to lead the Ming dynasty, shall pass my sentence. You, who have spilled the blood of our people for years on end, are guilty of the most heinous of crimes and shall hereby be sentenced to death. Executioners stepped forward with swords in hand, beheading the warlords and other challengers to the throne one by one. By the time the last severed head filled the basket, the people who had watched the scene unfold broke out into a cheer. A new era of peace had been established with this act, and though the emperor was young, he clearly had several advisors who were at least competent enough to end a war that had ravaged their lands for decades. Unbeknownst to the Ming public, the entire scene was being recorded by reconnaissance drones, operated by the German military, which were displaying the end of the war throughout the Reich. It was a particularly gruesome scene, but the end of the civil war in China marked the end of hostilities around the globe. For the first time in a very long time, the world was at peace, a peace brought on by the rise of the German Reich and its global hegemony. Kaiser Hans von Kufstein was immediately accosted by journalists as he exited the Reichstag, where he had just given a speech to the parliament. He had been informed about the developments in the Ming dynasty only moments before, but he had already mentally prepared a statement, knowing that this exact situation would unfold. I am aware of the ongoing developments in the Ming dynasty, and I would like to congratulate the young emperor on both his victory and his wisdom. If he should wish to reopen his borders and establish trade with the Reich once more, we would be more than willing to do so. After such a devastating conflict, we believe it would be entirely possible to help rebuild what has been destroyed. That is all I have to say on the matter. Now, please, I am running late for my next appointment. Hans was not dressed in his ceremonial regalia. Such trappings seemed almost primitive to him. While his father liked to dress like a 19th-century nobleman, Hans himself cared little for the intricate attire. He preferred a much simpler, more comfortable three-piece suit, which he wore without honors or distinctions, despite earning many through his years of service to the Reich. By now, Hans was nearly 40 years old. His children were in their teens and 20s, yet he still looked like a young man no older than 30. Today was his daughter's 16th birthday, and he had already missed the early celebrations by performing his duties to the Reich. He had promised the girl he would be there for her big day, yet he was absent thus far. Thus, he did not hesitate to have his Leibgard clear a path through the swarm of journalists so he could get into his car, which took him back to the royal palace, where his family was waiting for him. Hans had not followed his father's example but had as many children with his wives as possible. After all, with modern medical technology, it was nearly impossible for them to die in childbirth, a luxury Beringer did not have. By now, he had 10 children with each of his wives. The youngest were still in their single digits, while the oldest were in their 20s. Unlike his father, Hans spent the majority of his time with his family, allowing the many institutions his father had built to run the nation in his stead. Very rarely did Hans have to personally interfere in matters of rulership, and when he did, he was treated with the utmost respect. The fortune his father had built for their family was larger than ever, and each child who became an adult received their own estate somewhere throughout the fatherland. However, the royal palace, now one of many that the von Kufstein family owned, was reserved for the Kaiser and his immediate family, who were still underage. Thus, when Hans entered the home where he had grown up, he could only smile as he was greeted by several of his children, as well as his 5 wives, all of whom were enormously happy to see him. The daughter in question, who was celebrating her 16th birthday, was a beautiful young woman named Hildegard, resembling her mother, and her Aunt Henrietta. She had been pouting throughout her birthday celebrations, believing her father had broken his promise, until she heard the door open and saw his figure enter the doorway. Naturally, she glomped him, kissed him on the cheek, and welcomed him home. Daddy's home. Hans simply chuckled as he swung around the room with his daughter, now a grown woman, before gently placing her down on the floor. She was wearing a gorgeous dress for the birthday ceremony, as well as a stylish tiara. After all, she was a princess and wanted everyone to remember that today. As a doting father, Hans petted her silky blonde hair before asking a question in a teasing tone. One that made her incredibly embarrassed. "You don't think I would forget my baby girl's big day, would you?" Hildegard flushed in embarrassment, looked down at her toes with a guilty expression, which only further endeared her to her father. He then took her hand and led her into the palace grounds, knowing that was where the real celebration was. Upon arrival, Hans witnessed the spectacular display he had arranged for his daughter's 16th birthday, which included everything from snacks, a private carnival, and entertainment in the form of 2 men engaging in armored combat. For some reason, the young generation was currently fascinated with the way the world was before Beringer had arrived to change it. And thus, one of the most popular sports in the Reich right now is armored combat, where 2 men dress in 15th century armor and battle with blunt weapons for the entertainment of the crowd. After all, it has been less than 100 years since the days when knights reigned supreme on the battlefield. Historical European martial arts have survived the transition fully intact, with many of the old knights and men-at-arms teaching the new generation their ways so they can fight for sport. Hans gazed down at his daughter's lovely smile and asked her a single question while her glistening azure eyes gazed upon the contest of prowess between the 2 knights. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Hildegard blushed and looked away from her father, muttering something so low that Hans thought he might have misheard her. "I am, now that you are here, Daddy." Hans simply smiled and petted the girl's head once more before shifting his gaze back to the fight between the 2 armored opponents. He was only a boy when the age of knights and swords came to an end, brought to ruin by his father's own hand. While the younger generation may romanticize the nobility of a bygone era, Hans knows that the world is much better off now than it was in those hard and bloody days. He is just glad that his children will never have to experience what it was like when he was born. The sound of bells could be heard throughout the entire city of Kufstein, but these were not the bells of mass calling followers of Christ to hear the word of God. Nor did they signify an enemy attack, as in olden times. These were the solemn bells that preceded a funeral of the gravest importance. A long line of cars preceded and followed the funeral truck, which carried the bodies of Beringer's parents. Both had recently passed away from old age. It was not surprising that they had passed away. Beringer was now in his 60s, his oldest children were in their 40s, and his oldest grandchildren were in their 20s. There were even a few great-grandchildren who had already been born. Sieghard had died at the ripe old age of 98, and his wife had passed away a few days later from grief. To Beringer, this was not the most sudden news, but it was indeed heartbreaking. It had been nearly 50 years since he last lost a family member, one whom he had slain with his own hand. He grieved for Lambert's death as a rival might grieve the loss of their greatest competitor. But to lose his parents simultaneously was enough to bring a man to his knees. Despite no longer being the great Kaiser of the German Empire, Beringer remained absolutely stoic as he sat in his armored limousine, which carried his wives and his dearest beloved, Henrietta. All were bawling like little girls, especially Henrietta, who clung to her beloved elder brother and lover tightly for comfort. Beringer did not make the slightest facial expression as he petted the woman's golden hair, which refused to gray with age. Largely because of the magical properties of the mystical pool, where they all bathed once a month to maintain their youthful appearance. Beringer, of course, had aged worse than his wives. Despite the powerful mystical pool in the Icelandic village, it could not hide the decades of stress that came with building the world's most powerful empire. Though he did not appear his own age, his hair and beard had grayed, and there was the slightest trace of wrinkles beneath his weary eyes. However, what made him look the oldest was the harrowed stare he gave as he gazed out the window, toward the legions of mourning citizens gathered on the sides of the streets to say their farewells to the couple that gave birth to their mighty emperor. Eventually, the car arrived at the Grand Cathedral of Kufstein, where Beringer stepped out of the lead vehicle, followed by Henrietta, Adela, and his other wives. In the second vehicle were Hans and his wives, along with the numerous grandchildren Sieghard and Gisela had in life, including the bastards. By the time the von Kufstein family entered the Grand Cathedral, they numbered well over 100. The moment Beringer entered the cathedral, he gazed upon the closed casket containing both his father's and mother's bodies. He had utterly refused an open casket ceremony, as he did not wish to remember his parents as corpses, a decision with which Henrietta, the only other living child of Sieghard and Gisela, also agreed. Beringer sat down at the head of the pews, alongside his sister-lover, who was still crying as the priest Ludolf delivered his sermon about her parents. Dearly beloved, we gather here today to mourn the passing of Sieghard von Kufstein and his loving wife, Gisela. Sieghard was a nobleman and a pious man, but most of all, he was a wise one. When the time came to give up his seat as the Viscount of Kufstein, he did so without hesitation, so that his eldest son and heir, our great Kaiser Beringer von Kufstein, could lead the German people into an era of greatness. Afterward, Sieghard and Gisela retired to the countryside and lived humble lives. Though they have passed from this mortal world, Sieghard and Gisela leave behind a large and loving family who have all gathered here today for this occasion. Among them, Beringer, their eldest son, would like to say a few words. Beringer immediately stood up from his seat and stepped forward, where he hugged Ludolf like a brother. Though they had not been on the best of terms over the past few decades, at this moment, he felt closer to Ludolf than ever before. He then stood before the two caskets and placed his hand on the one that belonged to his father. The casket was made of solid gold and was carved in the shape of Sieghard, as he was when he was a young man and a warrior, wielding his sword in battle for the Habsburg line. Beringer gazed upon this image of his father and struggled to hold back the tears in his eyes, whispering something beneath his breath that only he could hear. I will never forget what you have done for me in this life, especially in regards to Henrietta. I hope one day soon, we can reunite in the afterlife, so I can be the son you both deserved. After saying this, Beringer approached the podium, where he forced himself to remain emotionless as he spoke the words that resonated throughout his mind. Though his face was stoic, his eyes were filled with grief, and everyone who had gathered for this funeral knew exactly how deeply the man was wounded by the loss of his parents. What can I say? My father and mother are the reason I am the man I am today. I wish I had spent more time with them, especially earlier in life when we were all so young. But there were wars to fight and cities to develop, and because of that, I never had the relationship I truly desired with my parents, a mistake I hope my children don't repeat. My father was a good man, maybe too good, and because of this, he did not see what my little brother had become. This haunted him until his final breath. But he was a strong man. He did not let Lambert's death drive him to despair, at least not for long. He fought and survived, living to the ripe old age of 98. I find it hard to believe that this day has finally come. It was just a week ago that I was on the phone with him, discussing the past as if it were only days behind us, rather than decades. And my mother, she was a pious woman, a loving mother and grandmother. She helped raise me to be the great Kaiser that you all know. I loved my parents, but I just wish I could have shown them how much I cherished them in this life. Thank you all for coming today, it means a lot to me. And I have nothing further to say. Beringer then sat down beside Henrietta and did not speak for the rest of the service. Nor did he speak after his parents were interred in the von Kufstein crypts. He honestly did not remember what had happened during this time. Apparently, he spoke with his father's surviving widow, Mibusaya, who was handling the situation almost as badly as he was, though she had her daughters to comfort her in this grim hour. After the wake, Berenger met with every family member before returning to his lakeside villa. He sat in silence, staring at the stars while drinking. He did not return to his bed that entire night. Instead, he had many questions only the gods could answer. At that moment, he suddenly remembered a promise he had made to a certain sister of fate many decades ago, one he had yet to fulfill. Perhaps it was time to return to the sacred grove and speak to Wird about matters he did not understand. For his heart would never rest until he confirmed he would be reunited with his parents in the afterlife, something he had forgotten when he made his request to the All-Father decades ago. After the death of his parents, Berenger felt increasingly depressed, with an impending sense of doom. Though he was getting old, his appearance was much younger than his actual age, and it was uncertain when death would come for him. Besides this, he became increasingly obsessed with the gods and the promises they had made to him. When he asked for an afterlife of his own, he did not specify whether his parents would join him there. Now that they were gone, this was all he could think about. Thus, Berenger decided it was time to fulfill a promise he had made decades ago, one he had entirely forgotten until now. With this in mind, he took the first flight he could to Schleswig-Holstein, accompanied by only a small contingent of his Leibgard. With supersonic travel now the norm, it did not take long for Berenger to arrive in the region. He then acquired a few military transport trucks from the border and drove into the lands now ruled by his son Christopher. It had been many years since he last entered these lands, and they had changed significantly since then. The region was no longer a feudal area where lords ruled over their serfs. Instead, Christopher's reforms had transformed Denmark and the surrounding areas into a civilization at its pre-industrial peak. The towns were large, and the food was plentiful. The fields were harvested by horse-drawn machines and stored in large silos. In many ways, this country resembled pristine Germany. Berenger could only smile at the progress made since his son's coronation as emperor. Eventually, he arrived at the same misty forest where he had once met the Norn sister Wird. Just as before, it was shrouded in a miasma of supernatural origin, one that separated any invaders from their comrades when crossed. Because of this, Berenger commanded his Leibgard to wait for his return as he entered the familiar forest. Or should he say the unfamiliar forest? The landscape had changed completely around him. However, a familiar voice spoke up once he had delved sufficiently deep into the misty woods. It was a young, feminine voice, filled with contempt. "You sure kept me waiting long enough. I thought you had forgotten your promise, Berenger Sieghardsson. Why have you chosen to visit me now?" Simply hearing his father's name caused Berenger's heart to bleed. But, he mustered his strength and spoke the words he wished to say. "I need some guidance. And you are the only one who can help me." After saying this, the mists parted to reveal the figure of a young girl, no older than 13. She looked almost identical to Adela when Berenger had first met her, even with the same golden blonde twin tails. However, the young girl wore a blindfold and had blood-red tattoos across her body that took the form of the roots of Yggdrasil. Despite appearing blind, Wird could clearly see everything in front of her, as evidenced by her comment about Berenger's appearance, which he found both insulting and endearing at the same time. "Poof. You got old. Has it really been so many years? You tend to lose track of time in a place like this." Berenger smiled genuinely for the first time since his parents' death, nodding his head to assure Wird that it had indeed been that long. "Apologies, I know I promised to visit you the last time we met, but unfortunately, I've been quite busy." Wird did not seem to accept this apology. She looked at Berenger as if he were a filthy liar. Then, she walked up to him and stared deep into his eyes, despite her own being covered by a blindfold. After taking a good measure of the man, she sighed heavily before revealing she already knew his reason for visiting. "I see. So your parents have finally passed from the mortal world, and you're now wondering about their spirits? Well, I suppose I could inform you about where they are. Or should I say, show you?" Come, drink from my well, and see the afterlife with your own eyes. Berenger followed Wyrd to the base of Yggdrasil, where she took out a wooden spoon and dipped it into her starry well. She then handed it to Berenger and had him take a drink, but warned him about what had happened the last time he cautiously drank from the well's water. Remember, just a sip. Any more could be potentially fatal. And we don't want a repeat of what happened last time. Berenger simply smiled at the young girl, and did as she instructed, taking a sip from the spoon. Then, he fell to the ground and passed out. When he awoke, he was no longer in the forest but in a large hall made entirely of gold. Everywhere he looked, people were feasting and drinking to their heart's content. There were no worries, and everyone appeared eternally young. Berenger had a hard time making out their identities until he spotted a gorgeous young woman, no older than 20, whom he recognized as his mother. He couldn't help but jump out of his seat and run over to the woman, who was conversing with a man roughly the same age, whom Berenger did not recognize. Mother! Gisela and the stranger took one look at Berenger and stared at him in horror. Their worst fears had been realized, and their son had finally passed away. Gisela grabbed Berenger's head and pulled it into her bosom, weeping for him. Oh, my baby boy, he has finally come to join us in the afterlife. Berenger was confused by this. After prying himself out of his mother's embrace, he looked at the stranger, who was gazing upon him with a hint of pride. It was only then that Berenger realized this young man was his father, who, in life, was significantly older than Gisela. Son, what are you doing here in heaven? Has it really been so many years that you have finally passed away? These words astounded Berenger, who looked at his mother and father, who appeared almost youthful, with a hint of grief in his eyes. No, you are mistaken. I am not dead, at least not yet. In fact, only a month or so has passed since you both left me. I am simply visiting. And father, this isn't heaven, at least not the Christian heaven. If I'm not mistaken, this is Brimir's hall. Only those with good souls have the privilege of residing here in the afterlife. Sigurd looked around at his surroundings and chuckled, before making a joke about the whole situation. Well, that would certainly explain the pagan aesthetic. But if you are not dead, then how have you come to find us? Berenger simply chuckled and shook his head before admitting he had a little help. I had some help from an old friend. Father, mother, I just need to know. Are you happy here? Sigurd and Gisela looked at each other for a few moments before smiling and nodding their heads simultaneously. Very much so. I can't imagine a better afterlife to share with your mother and me. For the first time in as long as Berenger could remember, he broke into tears after hearing this, though it was a solitary tear that fell down his left eye. He then wore a genuine smile as he hugged his two parents one last time, before giving them a proper farewell. Then I am happy for you. I wish I had been a better son to you in life, but I just want you both to know that I love you, and when I finally join you in the afterlife, I hope to prove just how much this is true. Gisela looked at her son with a pitiful expression and hugged him once more, while petting his golden hair. She then said the words of encouragement he needed to keep living. I love you too, my son. I always have. One day soon we will be reunited, but for now, you need to be strong, for yourself and for our family. Your work is not yet done, even if you are retired. And when you do finally leave your flesh behind and join us in the afterlife, we will be waiting here for you. Gisela she kissed on his forehead, which was the last thing Berenger remembered before waking up on the forest grounds. Wyrd was leaning over him with a worried expression on her face, as if the man might have once more drunk too much of the well water. But when he popped his head up, she quickly moved out of the way. She could tell he had a burning question in his mind and was quick to ask about it. Well? Berenger wiped the single tear from his eye, then wore a stern expression as he asked the most important question to him at that moment. When I finally pass away from this mortal world, will they be stuck in that place, or can they join me in the afterlife Odin has granted to me? Wyrd looked at Berenger as if he were an idiot before explaining the truth to him. All these years, and you still have the mentality of a Christian. There are various afterlives. What you just witnessed was Brimir's hall, which is the closest thing to your concept of heaven. Your personal heaven is a gift you don't understand the significance of. It is your own hall, or world, as you might put it. That is an honor only the gods have been granted until now. If you and your parents desire it, they may be able to travel between the two realms. But that will be up to the three of you. This answer caused Brimir to smile as he picked up the little girl and kissed her on the forehead, causing her to blush profusely. He then thanked the Sister of Fate before departing from the forest with a jolly gait. Thank you, WIRD, and if you ever get bored with your little domain here, you can always pop by my afterlife and visit after I have passed away from the mortal world. I hope we may meet again, whether in this life or the next. Once Brimir was gone, WIRD pouted before saying one word while alone in the forest. Dummy. Ever since the end of the last crusade, a war that broke the Catholic Church and reorganized Europe under the newly established German Empire, Hungary has been slowly but surely developing under the rule of the man named King. This man just so happened to be Noemi's older brother. However, in recent years, Kaiser Hans von Kufstein has begun applying pressure to the Hungarian nation, specifically in the form of ongoing Germanization. After all, the German language is now spoken across Europe as a secondary language, and in many ways, it is replacing the native tongues of the inhabitants. This is also the case for German culture, which is being emulated across the board. Hungary has even gone so far as to replicate the German architectural style, for which the Reich is well known, despite the lack of access to modern technology such as electricity. Thus, after several years of this ongoing process, Hans decided it was time to bring the Hungarian nation into the German fold and annex it as a colony, one which would thoroughly begin the process of Germanization. Today, he sits in the Hungarian royal palace, with Noemi by his side. Noemi's brother gazes upon her beautiful face with a hint of pride. It has been many years since he sent his sister away to the German Reich for a better life, and he had never thought that she would one day be the wife of the next Kaiser. In fact, he just wanted her to survive, unlike their sibling, who had passed away due to the sanctions placed on the Kingdom of Hungary following its alliance with the Catholic Church. Noemi seems rather indifferent to her brother. It has been so many years since they last saw each other that they are practically strangers, even if her brother does not feel that way. Yet this indifference does not deter the King of Hungary from speaking to his sister as if they were still as close as ever. Noemi, you have grown so beautiful. You truly are the spitting image of our mother. It has been far too long since we last spoke to one another, but I am wondering why you have finally come to visit your old home. Is everything all right? Noemi did not immediately speak, and instead sipped from her tea. She allowed her husband to do the talking, as this was his idea. Hans was glad to do it. Victor, by marriage, we are considered brothers. So, I decided to give you the courtesy of telling you in person. I plan to annex the Kingdom of Hungary and incorporate it into the German Reich as another state. It won't be a quick process, but in 2 generations, when the people of Hungary are considered German enough, they will be officially given status as a German state. For the time being, you can continue to call yourself king, and the Kingdom of Hungary will remain an independent state in name only. From now on, my soldiers will be stationed in your borders, my people will immigrate to Hungary, and we will develop your kingdom into a proper modern society. Victor looked at Hans in disbelief, then shifted his gaze to Noemi to see her reaction. Contrary to what he expected, she appeared entirely unfazed by this declaration, as if she knew about it beforehand. He quickly interrogated her for her opinion. Noemi, you can't be serious? You would hand Hungary over to the Germans? Why? Noemi glared at her elder brother with a cold gaze. It was almost as if she were speaking to an inferior as she explained the reason for her decision. Because I wish to be a Kaiserin, and not a mere princess of Hungary. If Hungary is incorporated into the Reich as a German state, then I have the right to call myself Kaiserin, as Duan and Veronica. This means my children will be able to fight for the crown. This isn't about you and your petty kingdom, brother. This is about establishing a new line of succession. My children deserve to be called Germans, just like those of my sisters, and I refuse to let you and your primitive thinking stand in the way. The Germanization of Hungary will go as planned, and your people will love you for it. After all, we will bring with us the technology for which we are renowned worldwide. You can't say that is a bad thing, can you? Victor could hardly believe his ears and quickly shifted his gaze to Hans, who was drinking from his teacup with a smug smile on his face. He suddenly began to plead, like a child before his parents, begging Hans not to go through with his plans. "My Kaiser, I have done everything you and your father have ever asked of me. Surely that is worth something? You're talking about erasing centuries of culture and heritage. You can't allow this to happen." However, Hans remained entirely indifferent to his brother-in-law and instead spoke harsh words in retaliation. 1,000 years ago, this was German land, ruled by the Gepids, the Lombards, the Goths, and the Vandals, before your ancestors came from the east and invaded. We are simply taking back what is rightfully ours. You can either agree to annexation, or we can fight to see whose claim is rightful, but I trust you know how that would end for you and your people. In fact, I doubt your men would even fight for you, knowing that you denied them the prosperity that comes with joining the Reich. My father inaugurated a new era for the world through sweat, blood, and tears. It is now the German era, and those who do not wish to obey our commands are free to fight to the last man. You have a choice, of course, but for the love I bear your sister, I suggest you choose wisely. Because it would pain me to break her heart. Noemi's expression showed that she was almost laughing at her husband's last words. As far as she was concerned, she was as German as Veronica. Both came from lands that had previously belonged to the German people, and both were thoroughly Germanized. She should have every right, like Veronica, to call herself Kaiserin, and she was willing to let her people be converted to make this happen. When Victor realized that his choice was to either willfully accept the death of his people's culture and heritage or take up arms in its defense, he understood he had no real choice. Waging war against the Reich and winning was nothing more than the fever dream of a madman. Thus, the Hungarian king sighed heavily before submitting to the German Kaiser and his demands. "Very well. I understand my position quite clearly. I agree to all of your demands. Hungary is yours to do with as you wish." Hans's lips curled into a cruel smile as he heard this, before nodding his head in agreement with his brother-in-law's words. Excellent. After his parents passed away, Brimir visited the Norn Wyrd to console his grief. He found that he needed to get away from home, at least for a while. Because of this, he chartered the massive cruise ship that served as the von Kufstein's personal yacht to take him and his family across the Atlantic to a well-known German colony famous for its vice. The journey went well, but the real excitement began when Brimir and his companions arrived in the land formerly known as Cuba in Beringer's past life. Neuhafen, a colony owned by the Backer Entertainment Company, was a leading casino and resort destination. Although Hendrik Backer, the eldest son of Gunther Backer, an old friend of Beringer's, owned the majority of the casinos in Neuhafen, Beringer decided to visit another casino/resort owned by Melissa, an old friend of Honoria's. The moment Beringer and his companions entered the casino, they were given the royal treatment, with Melissa herself greeting Honoria. It had been decades since the two women last saw each other. While Honoria appeared nearly 20 years younger than her age, Melissa did not. The former Byzantine prostitute turned pirate looked to be in her 60s. Upon seeing Honoria, Melissa nearly had a heart attack, hardly believing that the old pirate queen had aged so well. She quickly wondered if Honoria could be her daughter Helena. "Honoria, is that you? How can this be?" Despite her relatively youthful appearance, Honoria was indeed herself. She flicked her purple hair aside and smiled as she hugged her old friend and first mate. "Melissa, it has been far too long. I am honestly amazed at what you have made of yourself over the past few decades. It truly seems like you are in your element here in the New World." Melissa merely scoffed when she heard this, then commented on the other members of Honoria's crew who had survived this long. "It's not just me. Elfron has worked for me for a very long time, and some of the other girls from our original crew have moved here to Neuhafen. We always wondered what had become of you. Sure, we saw you in the papers, but we were unsure if you had ever really been happy. Judging by your appearance, you have been living an absolutely stress-free life for some time now." Honoria wore a friendly smile as she assured her old friend that she had indeed been living quite well. "Of course, I would not have left that life behind at such a young age if I were not ready to settle down and be with my family. My children have all grown up and have achieved extraordinary things on their own, and I love my husband very much." Upon hearing this, Berenger stepped forward and shook Melissa's hand.
Melissa, it has been too long.
I am glad to see your exploits have brought you such fame and fortune.
Surely you must have a family to share it with?
Contrary to what Berenger was expecting, Melissa did not seem the least bit bitter when she heard the word family. Just as Berenger was about to ask who was foolish enough to marry a former prostitute, a familiar face stepped forward and introduced himself. My Kaiser, I understand now why you have decided to refuse my offer.
You wish to reacquaint your wife with my own?
It had been many years since Berenger had seen Hendrik. In fact, the last time he saw the man, he was nothing more than a boy, living in Kufstein before Berenger's ascension. At the time, he was just a poor and emaciated serf. Yet now he was a robust man, clad in the most luxurious trappings. It was only now that Berenger realized Hendrik had been the fool who had married Melissa. He wrapped his arm around the woman's neck and kissed her passionately on the lips. Berenger had to conceal his thoughts as he greeted the man with a polite facade. Hendrik, I must say, I never thought all those years ago, when you were a boy plowing my fields, that you would one day become one of the most successful businessmen in the Reich and marry such a wonderful woman.
Tell me, how has your father been? Is he enjoying his retirement?
This question obviously rubbed Hendrik the wrong way, and not for the reason Berenger suspected.
He suddenly turned stiff, responding to Berenger's question with a rather bitter tone in his voice. I wouldn't know. My father and I aren't exactly on speaking terms, at least not since I married Melissa. You probably know more about his situation than I do.
I will be sure to attend the funeral whenever that happens, but until then, we will remain without contact. The word funeral made Berenger slightly upset, but he did not reveal it on his face. After all, he had attended 2 funerals since his retirement, those of his parents and his old friend Ludwig. To think that both Eckhart and Gunther were likely to be the next to enter the Reaper's embrace truly gave Berenger a foreboding mindset. Upon seeing that he had upset the former Kaiser, Hendrik bowed his head in apology.
I'm sorry, Your Majesty.
It was foolish of me to mention such a thing so soon after your own parents passed.
Please forgive me.
Despite being old and retired, Berenger still commanded respect and intimidation from his people and enemies.
However, he was no longer the wrathful man he once was.
The only thing that could awaken the fury within his ancient heart was an act of malice against his family. Thus, Berenger paid no mind to Hendrik's remarks, even though the man was practically sweating bullets at the thought of accidentally offending his Kaiser.
There is nothing to apologize for, Hendrik.
I will be sure to give your father my love when I return to the fatherland. In the meantime, I intend to play some cards while I am here.
As for Honoria, I will leave her in the capable hands of your wife.
I am sure they have much to catch up on. With this, Berenger kissed all of his women on the lips before heading off to enjoy the casino. Adela and Henrietta followed him, while the others went their separate ways in their own little cliques to enjoy the various forms of gambling that a casino as grand as this provided. Naturally, they were all protected by members of the lead guard to ensure no drunk tried anything with them. While Berenger tried his hand at a game of blackjack, Honoria went off with her old friend and first mate. The 2 women spoke for hours about how their lives had been since they first met and about the past they shared together. This vacation would last for 2 whole weeks before Berenger and his women returned to the fatherland, well refreshed from their little getaway. It was roughly 3 years after the death of Berenger's parents when he received a call from an old friend. The mighty Austrian general, who had been paramount to Berenger's early success in battle, and the current king of Prussia, Eckhard von Marienburg, was on his deathbed. Age had finally caught up with him, and while the Reaper was near, his family gathered by his side. Yet, it was neither his sons nor his wives whom he wanted to speak to in his final hour, but the man who had helped build the world's greatest empire. After receiving the call from Eckhard, Berenger took his private jet and flew to Marienburg. He entered the medieval fortress and found his old friend lying in bed. The years had taken their toll, and Eckhard was even older and frilier than the last time they played a game of chess in the royal gardens. Eckhard was practically skin and bones, and Berenger barely recognized him. Yet, the moment Berenger entered the room, Eckhard chuckled weakly before voicing his thoughts to Berenger, whose hair was now as silver as a fox's. You got old. Berenger looked at Eckhard and gazed at him with an expression that said, "Look who's talking?" This made them both laugh. That is, until Eckhard began to cough hysterically, and his nurse immediately helped by giving him a sip of water. With this brief exchange, Eckhard felt the need to continue the conversation and quickly did so. "It's good that you came. I was beginning to worry that you had forgotten about me." Beringer wore a bitter smile, shook his head, and assured Eckhard that such a thing simply wasn't possible. "Forget about my oldest friend? What have you been smoking?" This remark elicited a weak chuckle from Eckhard, but he soon returned to his wheezing. It was a struggle for him to speak, but he mustered every last bit of strength to convey what needed to be said. "I have many regrets in this life, and there are things I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but never had the courage. Now that I'm a dead man, I feel it's time to confess my thoughts." Beringer had suspected this might be the case when he received the call, and he had prepared to listen to Eckhard's final words the moment he decided to travel to Prussia. He gently took hold of the man's bony hand, reassuring him that no matter what he said, he would understand. "I figured as much. Go ahead, Eckhard. I give you permission to speak freely." It took Eckhard several moments to gather his thoughts before he began to speak of the words he had wanted to say for years. "When I look at how the world has changed, all because of your actions, I am truly astonished. I grew up in an age of knights and feudalism, and within 50 years, it has transformed into something I can barely recognize. Truly, you have single-handedly ushered in a new era of peace and prosperity for the German people. And I know I played a small part in it. But I can't help but think about the cost of remaking the world into what it is today. How many cities did you bury, along with all of their inhabitants? How many women and children have you slain in pursuit of this goal? I wonder if God will judge me as favorably as our people do. Because all I can think about is the overwhelming amount of death and suffering we have caused to those who are not our own. Entire civilizations have been wiped out because they incurred your wrath for one reason or another. Though their lives were snuffed out by your actions, I know you would not have been able to do so if I had not helped you gain power over Germany in the first place. Beringer, I must ask you, and I want you to answer me honestly, are we the villains in this story of our lives?" Beringer's expression was completely stoic. Not a single ounce of emotion could be seen on his face. And Eckhard had known Beringer long enough to understand what that meant. He was currently in an internal debate with himself. Finally, after a long and awkward silence, Beringer sighed, then wore a bitter smile before giving voice to his thoughts on the matter. "You only did what your lord commanded of you. You are not a villain, my friend. But I am. History will either remember me as the greatest man to ever walk the earth, or the most wicked. This is something I have thought about for some time, and it is a cross I must bear alone. You are not responsible for anything I have commanded you to do, or for anything I have done long after I freed you from my service. I alone am to blame for the deaths that have occurred during my conquests. So go forth, and face your Creator with a heart free of guilt." Tears fell from Eckhard's eyes as he heard these words from his Kaiser. His wheezing intensified as they crashed around him. There was a look of pain and conflict deep within Eckhard's haggard eyes as he voiced his next thoughts aloud. "And what if God judges me differently?" To this, Beringer simply scoffed, shaking his head with a conceited smile on his face. "Then I will march my armies into hell itself to liberate you from such an unjust sentence. Rest easy, Eckhard, for eternal paradise awaits you." Beringer didn't have the heart to tell a man on his deathbed that his religion was a lie, and that he would be spirited off to a pagan afterlife based on the virtues he followed in life. Instead, he could only comfort Eckhard with such an absurd statement. And it worked, for the tears dried from Eckhard's eyes, and a wide smile formed. He then began to cough, but it lasted only a few seconds before the old man said his final words. "Goodbye, my old friend. If you should find yourself forgiven in the eyes of the Lord, I would enjoy meeting you again in paradise." After saying this, the light faded from Eckhard's eyes, and with it, the old man breathed his last breath. Beringer then stared at the fresh corpse of one of his oldest friends in silence for several seconds before speaking his final thoughts. "Goodbye, Eckhard." After saying this, Beringer stood up from his seat and approached the family of a man who had been among his closest friends. There, he made a generous offer, one they did not expect. "You do not need to worry about his burial. The state shall pay for it. Eckhard shall be honored as one of our people's greatest heroes, and I will have a grand monument built in his memory. You have my word. Berenger did not wait for a response. Instead, he left the castle of Marienburg behind and flew back to his home. He remained entirely silent for the next 3 days, not even speaking a word to his many lovers. Immediately after Eckhard's death, Berenger began preparations for the man's funeral. He would not spare a single expense to ensure that the entire German Empire mourned the loss of his greatest friend. Before long, the leaders of the Reich gathered once more in Kufstein, specifically within its grand cathedral, to mourn the passing of one of its greatest heroes. The sad truth was that most people paid their respects to Berenger's parents simply because they were his parents. Their greatest act in life was raising Berenger to be the world's greatest leader. But Eckhard was different. His actions had changed world history and deliberately led to the creation of the German Empire. A line as long as the eye could see waited to pay their respects to the general who had been by Berenger's side from the very beginning. In the eyes of many, he was a military genius, second only to the great Kaiser. Naturally, Berenger himself was at the funeral, front and center, as he had been for his parents. Once more, Ludolf, now an elderly man himself, gathered the masses in his cathedral to properly send off a man of great importance to the afterlife. The sermon was brief but sufficient to honor the dead. Ludolf then asked those who were particularly close to Eckhard to step forward and speak a few words about him. Unlike with his parents, Berenger did not go first this time. Instead, he silently waited, as his wives held his hands in a desperate attempt to comfort a man whose friends and relatives were dropping like flies. Eventually, after Eckhard's wives and children each said their words, Adelbrand stepped forward and spoke of the battles he had fought by the man's side. The other generals who had served during Eckhard's time followed, each sharing their own stories. Then the men who had attended his lectures at the academy stepped forward to speak of what a great instructor he was and how his lessons had saved their lives during the wars that followed his retirement. Finally, after everyone of note had told their stories, Berenger stepped forward. Like with his parents, he had a completely stoic look on his face as he took the podium to say his final farewell to the man with whom he had started this long journey. Eckhard von Marienburg, or Eckhard von Hallstatt as I knew him, was very influential in my life. When I met Eckhard, he was nothing more than a beggar knight who had traveled across Austria and ended up on my father's lands in search of little more than wine. At that time, I had just begun to form a militia of peasants who would eventually become the backbone of what is today the German army. Firearms were considered crude and ineffective back then. However, my designs were superior, and Eckhard immediately recognized their potential. He stepped forward and swore his service not to my father, who was the Baron of Kufstein at the time, but to me as my sworn knight and protector. But I had no need for a knight, as I already knew that my weapons would soon bring about the end of their age. What I needed was a general, someone who could not only understand the new tactics I was introducing but also train others with a strategic mind to use them. And Eckhard was just that man. Most of you have likely seen the film The Mines of Wildskana, which has become a classic in our culture. Indeed, that story is based on a true event, when I was betrayed by my brother and trapped beneath the mines. It was Eckhard who gathered the militia in the dead of night and marched them to save me. When I was too wounded to effectively lead the defense of the shantytown established near the mine, it was Eckhard who commanded the militia to defeat the rebel lord's forces. From that day forward, Eckhard earned my trust and loyalty. He quickly became one of my closest confidants and followed my every order to perfection. Together, we overthrew the Habsburgs and united the Kingdom of Austria. Over the years, Eckhard led my forces to victory against all our foes until Germany was finally reunited. Yet, Eckhard's story did not end there. After uniting Germany into a single empire, Eckhard asked me to allow him to retire, which I did, for he had more than earned his peace. However, on the condition that he teach at the War College in Vienna, which he did marvelously. As you have already witnessed today, Eckhard's understanding of modern warfare allowed our officers to become the best in the world. Eckhard may no longer be with us, but his legacy lives on not only in the blood of his family but also in the minds of the officers who continue to teach at the Vienna War College and the students who carry his lessons into battle. Without Eckhard, there would be no Germany. Without him, I would not have lived long enough to accomplish all of my deeds. So, today we mourn the loss of one of Germany's greatest heroes and pray that his soul may finally find rest in the afterlife, whatever that may be. After saying this, Berenger stepped down from the podium and rejoined the crowd. Ludolf then began to perform the last rites for the deceased. Berenger watched as Eckhard's coffin was interred in the earth. Just as had been done for his parents not too long before, Berenger did not forget what followed their funeral. Instead, he held a grand feast in Eckhard's honor and announced the construction of a grand monument in his memory. The Reichstag immediately approved the funds for it on the spot. Ultimately, it was decided that the monument would not be built in Marienburg, where Eckhard had ruled as King of Prussia, but in Hallstatt, the small lake town in Austria where Berenger currently resided. After all, it was Eckhard's birthplace, and where his old family had once ruled as landed knights long ago. That night, Berenger drank himself to sleep, as it was the only way he could overcome the grief that plagued his heart, knowing that yet another of his friends and relatives was now buried beneath the earth. Having said goodbye to his parents and one of his best friends within a few short years, Berenger entered a depressed streak. He sat on the sofa, drank beer, and watched TV. By now, the Reich had advanced far beyond what it was when he had left so many years ago. Things that were once mere science fiction were becoming reality, making it difficult for Berenger to adjust to the new world. His children with Brynhilde were growing rapidly, while the rest of his children and grandchildren routinely visited him and his wives. If Berenger was being honest, he now longed for his youth in a way he never thought he would. As a young man, he led armies to triumph over kingdoms and empires. Now, he was just an old man sitting on the sofa and watching TV. It felt as if there was no purpose left in his life, and he was merely living each day until he finally stepped into the grave. In the meantime, his son sat in the seat of power for the world's largest and most powerful empire, overseeing the Reich's daily developments. There were many tasks to be done, but most were not Hans's problems. So, today, the current Kaiser decided to take a day off to visit his father. Hans entered the living room and found his father in a depressed state. It was no wonder, his loved ones were beginning to pass away. While Berenger may know what awaits him in the next life, the idea of living for several more decades without seeing them again was something he did not wish to do. When Hans saw the state his father was in, he knew something had to be done. Thus, he approached the old man, dragged him out of his seat, and gave him something to do other than just watching TV. "Get up, old man, and get dressed. We're going to Kufstein." Berenger did not know why his son wanted to drag him to the metropolis he had built and quickly inquired about his reasoning, albeit in a cantankerous manner. For what purpose? Hans simply sighed before revealing his thoughts on the matter. "I need you to give a speech to the Reichstag about the recent conversion of our people to the pagan religion practiced in Iceland. You're the one who started this, so you need to make people aware that it is okay to practice the faith of our ancestors. Even the church will have to back down from their outrage if you come forward and speak up on behalf of the pagans." Berenger could only sigh as he picked up his beer bottle and finished its contents in one giant swig. He then threw the bottle in the trash and climbed the steps of his villa to prepare himself for the speech. After nearly 30 minutes, Berenger descended the staircase and followed Hans into the nearby car, which would take them to Kufstein. By mid-afternoon, Berenger had arrived back in Kufstein for the first time since Eckhard's funeral. He did not have the ability to process just how much it had changed over the years while grieving the loss of his best friend. But now that he took a look around, he realized that Kufstein was a proper modern city. New and sleek skyscrapers had popped up throughout the city, blending well with the more traditional architecture built during his reign. The city streets were well maintained, and electric vehicles were surprisingly common. Something was just starting to emerge when he passed away in his previous life. There was even a maglev in the city center, sending high-speed trains across the Reich at speeds Berenger previously thought impossible. These maglev rails spanned the entire Reich, from as far west as Frankia to as far east as Rusland. The police force patrolled the city in armored vehicles, wearing the most advanced body armor available. They even had powered exoskeleton suits under their body armor to enhance their physical abilities, a technology also being tested in the military. The citizens continued to dress modestly, and the German Youth Corps remained a prominent presence in the city, engaged in charity and public service while dressed in their signature, slightly modernized uniforms.
Despite Kufstein's modernization, it did not suffer from the typical issues associated with such advancements.
Homelessness and crime were virtually non-existent, thanks to the ever-present police force and a society that raised its youth correctly.
However, one significant change Beringer noticed was the decline in polygamy.
In the past, a man would often be accompanied by multiple women and have numerous children with each. Now, for every 100 monogamous couples, there was only one polygamous couple, usually consisting of extremely wealthy and good-looking men. After driving through the city and observing all the changes, Beringer exited his vehicle and was led inside the Reichstag, where he stood at the podium for the first time in many years. Most of the politicians who had been in office during his reign were gone, replaced by men from the younger generation. Yet, there was still a look of admiration and respect in their eyes when they witnessed the great Kaiser of the German Reich enter the Reichstag for the first time in years. Standing by his side was the current Kaiser, who waited for his father to give the speech he had personally written. Beringer had memorized the speech but made some mental changes, speaking with the oration skills for which he was renowned. Hoping to captivate the attention of the public, as this speech was broadcasted across the world, he began. For those of you who don't remember me, my name is Beringer von Kufstein. It has been many years since I stepped down as Kaiser in favor of my eldest son, Hans. Until now, I have never felt the need to step forward and speak publicly about matters of state. However, as an educated man, I have kept up with the times, which is easier than ever now thanks to the internet. I have discovered a disturbing trend among the German people that is happening as we speak. Many of the more conservative elements of the German parliament nodded in agreement with Beringer's words, expecting him to speak about eradicating the pagan menace. However, they were shocked to hear his next words, as was everyone else. I'm talking, of course, about the increasingly hostile behavior towards those Germans who follow the religion of our ancestors. I know there are many of you who may be shocked to hear me voice my support for these pagans. But in many ways, I look back to the founding of our empire and how the Catholic Church tried so hard to stamp out the German Reformation. The result, of course, was disastrous for the Catholics, whose faith is now a footnote in the history of Europe. I believe that if the Reich continues to oppress these Germans, who choose to follow a religion native to our culture and our lands, it will inevitably lead to not only a schism within the Church but also civil unrest. This is why I have decided to come here today to try to convince you all that it does not matter which god a man may worship, only that he has German blood running through his veins. We are one people, bound by blood and soil. Because of this, we should not let something as petty as religious beliefs stand between us. So, remember to respect your fellow Germans, especially in these times, when the teachings of the Bible are becoming less and less certain. That is all I wanted to say. Thank you all for listening to the ramblings of an old man. After saying this, Beringer stepped down from the stage and returned to his secluded life in the mountains. But his words had single-handedly stopped the hostilities between the German Church and the pagan revival, partly because Beringer was respected as the founder of the German nation, and also because he was considered by the German Church to be a living saint. Thus, his words held enormous meaning for its followers, especially after he had compared their current actions to those of the Catholics, who are now thoroughly vilified in the history books. Hans sat in his office, observing reports from the German space program. It had been decades since humanity first entered space during Beringer's reign, and since then, the German Empire had made significant strides in colonizing the solar system. With functioning colonies on the Moon and Mars, humanity had taken its first step towards expanding beyond Earth's confines. Luckily, there had been no major disasters in any of the German colonies outside of Earth, otherwise, public support for the aerospace industry would be incredibly low. However, Hans was currently working on another project entirely, one that would allow much easier access to space. Recent advancements in materials science, such as the prevalent use of graphene and graphene composites in both the construction and technology industries, now made it possible to build structures that were once only dreams. For instance, the project Hans approved had 3 components. He intended to build space elevators on Earth, the Moon, and Mars. These elevators would not only drastically reduce travel time between the 3 celestial bodies but also facilitate the transport of materials from Mars and the Moon to Earth. It was estimated to take a minimum of 25 years to construct just one space elevator, likely in the vicinity of New Swabia on Earth. However, Hans was confident that with sufficient resources and manpower, the project could be completed much sooner. The vast wealth of the German Reich and the von Kufstein dynasty more than covered the costs. After all, the German Reich controlled most of the Americas and Africa, with much of Asia under their influence through contractual agreements. Not to mention the resources they had been extracting from space. The amount of resources at the German Reich's disposal was virtually limitless, allowing them to avoid importing raw materials from other countries, which would have reduced the costs of building these space elevators. While reviewing the expenditure report of their current construction efforts, Hans received a phone call. Glancing at the caller ID, he realized it was from one of his brothers. He instantly set the report aside and accepted the call, which came from the Nordic Empire, ruled by his younger brother, Christopher. With a perfectly stoic tone, Hans asked the question that immediately came to mind, "What's up, Chris?" "It must be something important if you're calling me, of all people." Despite being grown men in their 40s, Hans and Christopher still harbored unresolved issues from their childhood, particularly regarding the favoritism their father had shown toward Hans. As a result, they were not particularly close. In fact, it was probably for the best, as their conversations often devolved into petty disputes. This was so severe that, despite being world leaders of allied nations, Hans and Christopher typically communicated through representatives rather than directly. For Chris to call Hans so randomly, without any prior notice, something serious must have happened. Hans quickly addressed this. "I'd like to ask you for a personal favor, not that you are inclined to respect me. But I need you to stop your people from illegally crossing my border. I don't know what's going on, but a bunch of Germans are entering Jutland, searching for something related to the ancient pagan deities they worship. And they're causing a lot of problems with the local Christians. Denmark is in a state of unrest because of it, and I might have to march my forces down there to deal with it if you don't." Hans sighed heavily as he heard this. Despite the friendly state between the two nations, there was a strong military presence at the border between the German state of Schleswig-Holstein and the Kingdom of Denmark, which was part of the Nordic Empire. If people were getting past that border, it meant someone in the military was allowing them to do so. Every now and then, a corrupt official would get into a position of power and cause problems. It was simply human nature to abuse authority. Because of this, the German Reich was on a constant crusade to remove corrupt officials from both the government and civilian sectors. Knowing that corruption was rearing its ugly head again, Hans could not help but pinch the bridge of his nose in an attempt to calm himself before responding to his brother's claim. "I'll look into it. Thank you for alerting me to this development. I promise that within a fortnight, whoever is responsible for this will be court-martialed and executed. Now, was there anything else you needed, or can I get back to my work?" Christopher sighed heavily, knowing that he and his older half-brother were likely never to get along in this life. As much as he wanted to end the call with this jerk, there were some family matters he wanted to discuss. "I saw the old man on TV the other day. How is he doing?" Hans appeared rather annoyed by this question and responded with a particularly jaded tone in his voice. "He's fucking old. How do you think he's doing?" Knowing what the old man gets up to in his free time, I wouldn't be surprised if he had a heart attack any day now while banging Brynhilde. "Do you know that woman is still having kids? What number are they on now? Their 30th child? Or was it their 35th? I can't even remember." Christopher scoffed at the idea before sharing his thoughts. "Well, she is immortal, and you know how our father is. Imagine what Iceland will be like 500 years from now, when they all have the blood of literal battle angels running through their veins." There was a clear tone of exhaustion in Hans' voice as he spoke. "I don't even want to think about that. Jesus, I'm currently dealing with the aftermath of Father's declaration of tolerance toward paganism. The church appears to be backing down, but its more militant elements still want to curb paganism before it takes a permanent hold over the country. I'm meeting with Ludolf tomorrow to ensure the church ceases its hostilities. But goddamn, you and I both know the pagan gods are real. It takes all my resolve not to yell at the Christians and tell them their religion is a lie, even if it is the basis of our civilization. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if paganism just completely replaced the Christian faith in the Reich." Christopher's voice carried a hint of worry as he spoke about these thoughts. "Well, I certainly hope that isn't the case.
Because if that does happen, the warrior spirit that ended with Father's reign would be reignited in your people.
And they would look to wage war against every country, so that the entire world is German. And there would be nothing any of us could do to stop it.
Hans sighed again before responding to his brother's fears with an exhausted tone.
Perhaps the pacifism of Christianity is necessary, or perhaps it will be the death of us all. I don't really care which religion is the most popular, as long as my people behave logically and rationally. But the people are still very religious, and because of that, it seems I now must meet with the heads of the church.
Well, it has been nice talking to you, little brother. But I need to get back to my work. This damn space elevator isn't going to build itself.
Christopher had no idea what a space elevator was, nor did he want to interrupt Hans for much longer. He simply said farewell before hanging up.
Goodbye, Hans.
I'm sure we will speak again soon.
With that, Hans sat back and contemplated the complex issue of the revival of paganism among the German population.
In the end, he put that thought aside for another time and got back to reading the space elevator's expenditure report. Beringer stood in the lands of the Aztec Empire. It had been a lifetime since he last visited these lands, and now his son, Qualcohl, was by his side. By now, Beringer was in his 70s, and despite looking a decade or two younger, he felt his life quickly coming to an end. He would likely only live to be 80. Perhaps it was the wear and tear he had endured during his youth on the battlefields, or the damage his body had sustained during his trials to prove his worth to Odin. Or perhaps it was simply the weave of fate. But Beringer knew he only had a few years left. While his body had begun to age rapidly, the blessings of the gods had started to wear off. He wanted to say goodbye to an old ally while he still had the ability to do so. Thus, Beringer had journeyed across the world to the jungles of Mesoamerica, where he found himself once more standing before the Great Pyramid of Teotihuacan. Beringer cried out in the loudest voice he could manage to a being that had been forgotten by time itself. His son, Qualcohl, gazed upon him as if he were suffering from dementia as he did so. "Oh, great goddess of Teotihuacan, I have returned at last. Please reveal yourself to me and my progeny. We wish to pay our respects." Qualcohl was educated in Germany and, because of this, had a very secular outlook on religion. Though he personally did not believe the gods of his people really existed, religion was still a driving factor in the Aztec Empire. Thus, he simply scoffed at his father, as if the man was finally losing his marbles. That is until a voice appeared, along with a sudden mist. "So you have come to say goodbye to this goddess at last? Very well, I will hear your words, Beringer von Kufstein." Once the mist took over the decrepit ruins of an ancient civilization, it quickly dispersed, revealing a city that was entirely intact, as if it had never collapsed. The most notable thing, however, was the absence of all life except for Beringer and his son. Qualcohl was astonished by what had just happened and could hardly believe his eyes. He was just about to remark on it when his father urged him to keep up. "Come on, boy, I'm an old man. You should be able to keep up with my pace." Snapping back to reality, Qualcohl scurried after his father, who had a hard time climbing the many stony steps leading into the Great Pyramid of Teotihuacan. Once inside, Qualcohl was astonished to see a beautiful Mesoamerican woman sitting on a throne, with her elaborate headdress by her side. Most surprising of all, Beringer kneeled in front of this woman, as if she were his master. Understanding that he was supposed to kneel, Qualcohl followed suit, listening to his father speak to the supernatural entity before him. "Oh, great goddess of Teotihuacan. My son and I have come to pay our respects, and I have come to personally say goodbye." The beautiful goddess's face was melancholic as she saw what had become of Beringer. The years had rapidly taken their toll, as the blessing from the mystical pool wore off. Though he looked like he was in his 60s, the goddess knew that within a year, possibly two, he would look his true age, if not worse. Thus, rather than looking at his miserable state, she waved her hand and temporarily reversed his age, back to when they had first met. She then wore a sultry smile and expressed what she had done. "I can only do this much for you, and it will immediately expire the moment you step out of my domain. But I definitely prefer the way you were the last time you visited." Beringer looked at his reflection in a pool of crystal clear water and smiled. He was young again,
truly young, not just in appearance. His body felt temporarily rejuvenated, as it had been when he was in his 20s all those years ago. Qualcomm was shocked to see his father's youthful appearance and was about to say something when the man effortlessly rose from his kneeling position and thanked the goddess for her temporary boon. To be young again, even if only for a day, is a great gift. I will treasure the few moments I have in this state. I apologize, goddess. I should have made the journey earlier, but I knew that when I did, it would be our last meeting. I could not bear the thought of leaving you all alone here, without hope of seeing me again. The goddess wore a bitter smile as she gazed upon Berenger's weary expression and shook her head, assuring the man that she was just thankful he had returned to say goodbye. I honestly did not think you would pay attention to someone as insignificant as myself. But I am happy you have come to say farewell. I can tell by your current state that you have a few years to live at most. But you have served your purpose in this world and will be granted a reward in the next life that is greater than anything I have ever witnessed a champion receive in the history of this world. Soon enough, you can rest in your own paradise, with all your loved ones. Perhaps, if you are willing, I can cross over to that plane and see you again. Berenger did not realize this was possible until now. When he heard these words from the goddess's mouth, he was quick to accept them. I would like that. I would not be alive today if not for you. I have come to give you my thanks and to say my farewell. When I finally enter the next life, I would not mind spending some time with you. You are, after all, one of my many benefactors. And just so you know, this is my son, Qualcomm. You remember the woman I was here with the last time I visited? She is his mother. He is the new Aztec emperor. I have brought him here today so that he may understand the reality of this world and perhaps even repay the favor I owe you. Qualcomm gazed up at his father in disbelief before asking the question that immediately came to his mind. Father, what are you saying? Berenger chuckled and then grasped his son's shoulder. He then asked his son to repay a debt he owed to the great goddess of Teotihuacan. I am asking you to do everything in your power to ensure that your people begin to worship this goddess once more. The gods gain power by the number of worshippers they have, and because of this, she is not long for this world, just as I am. If you can embrace her as part of your people's religion, she would be able to survive much longer, perhaps indefinitely. What do you say? Are you willing to do this for me? Qualcomm looked at his father and then at the goddess, before nodding his head in agreement. Now that he knew the gods really existed, he vowed to do everything in his power to earn their favor. Having come face to face with this beautiful goddess, he could not help but fall to his knees and worship her on the spot. I, Qualcomm, swear that I will do everything I can to spread the word of you, my goddess, from this day until the end of my days. The great goddess of Teotihuacan wore a sultry smile as she licked her lips before speaking. Your son is cute. Do you mind if I play with him a bit? Berenger chuckled when he heard this, then responded to the goddess. Only if he consents. Qualcomm looked up at his father and the great goddess of Teotihuacan, only to realize that he had been de-aged to his early 20s. The goddess stepped forward, took his hand, and whispered something seductive in the Aztec emperor's ear. Show your devotion to me. With that, Qualcomm followed the great goddess of Teotihuacan to a more private chamber, where he would become the second member of Berenger's family to lie with a goddess. Hans sat at his desk, fumbling with a round, golden-colored crystal. It had been years since his father had given him this divine artifact, and during this time, he had never truly paid the price required to gain its power. After all, he had never felt the need to carve out his own eye and replace it with the Eye of Horus. But recently, he had begun to feel quite paranoid, not only about his own personal safety but also that of his family. The peace his father had established had lasted for decades, and though one might think this would bring a sense of calm to the new Kaiser, Hans had grown increasingly anxious as time passed. He had begun to question who was friend and who was foe, to the point where it ate at his mind throughout the night. Knowing that he had the power to confirm someone's true feelings towards him, Hans struggled to come to terms with the price he must pay to wield such power. Currently, there was a scalpel sitting on his desk, along with some rubbing alcohol. If he was going to do this, he would not opt for a surgical procedure, which he could easily perform. No, that would defeat the purpose of the sacrifice that must be made.
Instead, Hans intended to follow the same path as his father, who had earned this great power by shedding his own flesh. Thus, after careful consideration and a bit of liquid courage, Hans grabbed hold of the scalpel and dipped it in the rubbing alcohol, ensuring it was sterilized before slowly but surely beginning to cut out his right eye. The pain was unbearable, and at several points, Hans thought he was going to die, but in the end, a severed eyeball fell to the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Once he had done this, it was only a matter of shoving the glowing gem into his empty eye socket, which he did quickly. In a matter of seconds, the damage to Hans' eye was repaired, and a shimmering golden eye appeared. It paired well with his other sapphire iris. Once he had fully regained his sight, Hans looked into the mirror to inspect his appearance. The man was nearly 50, and his signature strawberry blonde hair, inherited from his mother, had begun to gray. Yet, he was still an incredibly handsome man, much like his father. Thus, he smiled at his reflection. However, he then heard a voice in his head. "Oh, has Brimir passed on already? Odd, why was I not invited to the celebration?" Hans quickly looked around to see where the voice was coming from, but confirmed he was alone. He simply sighed and looked at the mess he had created, commenting on his own delusion. "I must have scrambled my brains." However, the same voice repeated itself with a rather conceited tone. "On the contrary, you are a perfectly sane mortal. I was once the guardian of this artifact, and I have left behind a remnant of my soul to ensure it passed to a worthy successor. Tell me, what is your relation to Brimir?" Although Hans still believed he was suffering from a delusion, he decided to entertain the voice in his head for some reason. "I am Brimir's eldest son, Hans von Kufstein. How do you know my father?" The voice responded to Hans with a petty tone, almost as if it was angry with Brimir about something. "You are Brimir's eldest son? Not was? Am I to believe he is still alive? And yet he has already removed the Eye of Horus to pass on to you? Figures he would do something like that. Well, I suppose it's a good thing he's still drawing breath, or I would have had to have words with that bastard Odin about not inviting me to the celebration." Brimir had seldom mentioned the gods to Hans, or how he had obtained what he called the Eye of Horus. Thus, Hans had no idea who he was speaking to, or if this was even reality. But he was quick to inquire about the identity of this supernatural being. "Who are you? You haven't answered my question." The voice seemed to snap back to reality, as if it had been thinking about something before responding to Hans' question. "I am Anubis, the Egyptian god of the underworld. I met your father many years ago, when he entered my domain to claim the Eye of Horus as his own. Your father succeeded where many had perished. And by right, this artifact belongs to him. But if he has chosen to pass it on to you, his heir, I see no reason to withhold its powers from you. You have paid the price to obtain its power. Though I must warn you, due to your father's influence over Egypt and Sudan, my powers, and those of my peers, are quickly being restored. Because of this, the Eye of Horus will now be more powerful than it was in your father's possession. It might even drive you to madness. Knowing the risks, do you still wish to obtain its power?" Hans did not even hesitate to answer this question. Immediately after Anubis had asked, he responded with confirmation of his will. "Yes. I need to know who is loyal to me and who is plotting against me." There was almost a sound of satisfaction in Anubis's voice as he responded to Hans' words. "A wise choice. I look forward to what you do with this power, or if it will truly drive you to madness. You have my blessing, for what it's worth. And good luck in your future endeavors." After saying this, Hans's vision flashed with a bright golden light, and he was knocked unconscious by the supernatural power. He did not awaken for nearly 2 weeks, but when he did, he could not only see past people's facades and sense their auras, he could even discern their thoughts. This granted him the ability to know with absolute certainty who planned to harm him and how they intended to do it. Thus, the heirs to the German throne would forever have the power to prevent any plots and schemes that sought to undermine their rule or bring harm to the von Kufstein dynasty. As for how Hans spoke about his golden eye, which had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, he did not. In fact, he immediately concealed it with colored contacts. As far as the world knew, he remained the same as he had always been.
Today was not an average day, at least not for Berenger and his wife, Adela. Since his retirement, which had been nearly 15 years ago, Berenger spent most of his days secluded away in a small mountain town with his wife. But today, he and Adela were visiting Kufstein, specifically the Reichstag. Why was this the case? Not because Berenger was giving another speech. Instead, Kaiser Hans von Kufstein was presenting an award, not to Berenger, but to his wife, Adela. All the nation's greatest figures had gathered in Kufstein for this occasion. Currently, Berenger and Adela were sitting in the front row, watching Hans give a speech to the entire audience. Naturally, the event was televised, and Hans made sure he looked his best for the cameras. Hans spoke with an authoritative tone, wearing a proud smile as he declared the award he was giving to a woman who had been like a second mother to him. Today is a great day for the German Reich, as we honor a woman who has spent a lifetime advancing the arts and culture within our great nation. Kaiserin Adela von Kufstein has long been a patron of the arts, and many skilled artists have risen to prominence specifically due to her efforts to guide them. Today, I, Kaiser Hans von Kufstein, would like to present her with the Imperial Order of Arts and Science, so that her efforts may be properly rewarded. Adela, would you please come up here? Adela, now in her early 70s, did not look a day over 60 due to the power of the mystical pool and modern anti-aging technology. She stepped forward, wearing a gracious smile. After waving to the crowd, which cheered for her as if she were a rock star, Hans placed the medal around her neck and shook her hand, whispering something to her that only the two of them could hear. It is very much deserved. Without you, the Reich would only be a nation of war, and our culture would still be left in the feudal age. Thank you for everything you have done, Mother. Throughout his entire life, Hans had stubbornly refused to call any of Berenger's other women by the term mother. But today, he had done so specifically to show the respect he had for Adela. This caused Adela to blush slightly as she wrapped her arms around Hans and gave him a proper hug. Once she had done so, she smiled and waved to the cameras, knowing fully well that this was perhaps her last chance to shine in the public. Adela then took the podium and gave a speech she had prepared for this moment, after first being made aware that she would receive such a prestigious medal. I don't know what to say. When I first approached my husband and pleaded with him to sponsor artists across his territory, the world was a very different place back then. Noble families like ours owned all the land, while the common man plowed the fields to receive a small portion of his hard work. Today, the common man is able to pursue any career their heart desires. Especially those artists, who would have struggled to survive back in those days, are now able to study at acclaimed universities to learn the skills and techniques they need to be successful. Not only that, but they can also use the internet to learn these same techniques for free. It is a wonderful time we live in, and I am glad to see that all my efforts over these many years have not gone to waste. I want to thank my husband, Berenger von Kufstein, for helping me pursue my dreams and for being the largest sponsor of artists across the German Reich. I would also like to thank every artist, no matter their field, for their hard work and creativity, which have allowed the German Reich to become the center of the world's culture. Lastly, I would like to thank Kaiser Hans von Kufstein for recognizing my efforts and rewarding me in such a prestigious manner. Thank you all, and God bless. After saying this, Adela descended from the stage and sat next to Berenger, who wore a proud smile. He held her hand and, in a voice so low that only the two of them could hear, said, "I am so proud of you, Adela. You truly deserve this award, perhaps more than anyone. I love you." Adela smiled and hugged her husband, whispering back, "I love you too." The awards ceremony continued for a bit longer as artists Adela had supported came forward to thank her for all she had done. Nearly every major living artist in the Reich, whether painters, sculptors, animators, musicians, and so on, attended the event, and they all praised her for making their dreams come true. After everyone had expressed their thanks and appreciation, Adela and Berenger returned home, where they enjoyed some time alone together before eventually falling asleep in each other's arms. While Adela cherished the recognition and praise she received that day, it was the quiet moments with her husband that she valued most. She felt a little sad, knowing that today would most certainly be her last chance to shine in the spotlight. Still, as long as she could be with Berenger in their lakeside villa, she did not really care too much about fame or fortune. All she had ever cared about was Berenger and the family they created together. Thus, today was ultimately a fitting end to her story.
As the years went by, Berenger's health began to fade. Finally, at the age of 80, the Reaper kept a constant watch. At that moment, Berenger was lying in a bed in the royal palace of Kufstein, where he had been transported so that the von Kufstein dynasty's personal doctors and nurses could look after him in his twilight hours. Berenger was surrounded by his wives, lovers, children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, all of whom had forlorn faces as they said goodbye to the man who had built their house from the ground up. Despite knowing his time was coming to an end, there was no pain on Berenger's face. Instead, there was only bliss. To be surrounded by his loved ones in his final hour, after a lifetime of accomplishments that no man had ever matched before and no man would ever match in the future, was truly a fitting end for the great Kaiser of the German Reich. Currently, Berenger's hands were held by each of his women, who were nearly as old as he was, yet much livelier. Linda was in tears, witnessing the man she had loved more than anything for almost her entire life slowly slip away into the afterlife. This moved Berenger to grip her hand firmly, using all his strength to shake his head. "Do not cry, my love. I am going to a better place, a realm where I will be eternally young. And soon enough, you all will join me. I have loved you since the night we were first together, and I always will." Despite his words, this did not stop the tears from Linda or any of his other women. Next, Adela hugged him desperately. Who begged her husband to stay with her until the day the Reaper finally took her away. "Please. Don't leave me here all alone. Berenger, I love you." Berenger mustered all the strength in his body to stroke the woman's silky hair one last time, before assuring her everything would be all right. "I will await you in the afterlife. Adela, if there is one regret I have in this life, it is how poorly I treated you. You deserved better. But I promise to make it up to you when we reunite." This only caused Adela to cry even more, as she hugged Berenger tightly, fearing that if she let go, he would leave her forever. After Adela had said her farewell, Honoria was next. The Byzantine princess was just as heartbroken as her two oldest rivals. She kissed Berenger's wrinkled forehead and assured him that she would be joining him soon enough. "Berenger, my love, do not fret. I am sure Linda and I will join you soon enough. Besides, you will have Brynhildr to keep you company until we meet again." Berenger simply smiled in response to this and nodded his head in understanding of Honoria's words. Then Yasmin grasped his head and clung to it to her bosom one last time, all the while saying her personal farewell. "Husband, you have always been my one and only love. I promise we will meet again soon enough. Until then, be strong, and know that I love you more than anything." Henrietta was next, and her goodbye was perhaps the most heartbreaking of them all. "Big brother, please don't leave me here without you. I have always been by your side, and I don't know what I will do once you are gone. Please don't go." Berenger weakly reached out his hand and grasped his little sister's, where he had previously commented on their complex relationship, one that should never have happened. "Henrietta, my dear, you have always been, and will always be, my beloved little sister. But I am afraid I won't be able to protect you any longer. At least not until we meet again. Do be a good girl until that day, won't you?" Henrietta was crying profusely as she nodded her head, promising her elder brother and lover that she would remain a good girl. "I promise, big brother, I promise I will behave." One by one, Berenger's lovers and children stepped forward to say their farewells. Finally, only his sons, specifically those who were monarchs, remained. Berenger gazed upon the boys he had raised to rule the world in his stead, and spoke of his pride in them. "My sons, the kings of this world. I gaze upon you and all that you have accomplished, and can only voice my pride in what you have become. However, soon I will no longer be in this world to guide you as I have always strived to do. So allow me to give you this one final piece of advice. No matter what petty disputes you may have in this life, remember your bond as brothers. Nothing is more important than our family, and you should raise your children to believe this as well. So long as a von Kufstein sits on the world's major thrones, and you remember that you are of my dynasty, then I truly believe some semblance of peace can be obtained throughout the world. Hans, I am entrusting the empire I have built into your capable hands. Remember my final words, always." With this said, Berenger closed his eyes and breathed his last breath. Exiting the world of the living once and for all, though all the women in the room cried their eyes out, the men remained completely stoic, as their father would have wanted them to. Beringer awoke in a grassy meadow, with the sun shining upon his face. It was so bright that he found it troublesome. As he opened his eyes, he gazed upon the massive mammaries which belonged to his wife, Brynhilde. There was a warm and gentle smile on her face as she stroked her lover's golden hair. "Good morning, sleepy head. How did you sleep?" Beringer was immediately confused about where he was and what had happened, and he instantly rose to his feet, so quickly that he felt as if he were 50 years younger than when he had gone to sleep. Confused about everything, he looked around to see a large and peaceful plain where animals frolicked and trees grew to monumental heights. Not knowing where he was or how he had gotten there, Beringer quickly asked the gorgeous Valkyrie what had happened. "Where am I? Where are the others? What has happened?" There was a warm and gentle tone in Brynhilde's voice as she stood up and held her lover's hand, explaining to him what this world was and where he had gone. "This is your personal afterlife. The one the All-Fathers promised to you so many years ago. Do not worry about your family. Though they grieve for your loss, your wives and lovers will be joining you shortly. Until then, I suggest we get started. It would be pretty embarrassing if they were to arrive and witness the sorry state of this world." Beringer took another glance around him before asking the question that immediately came to his mind. "Get started? On what? There's nothing here." It was only now that Beringer caught his reflection in Brynhilde's ice-blue eyes and realized he was a young man again, as he had been when he first transmigrated into his second life. Bewildered by this state, he was about to ask another question when his lover answered his previous one. "Exactly. There is nothing here. This is exactly what you wanted, isn't it? A place you and your family can call your own, one you can build to fit your greatest desires. It is a new life, an eternal life. And everything your eyes gaze upon is yours by right. You are free to do with this world as you wish." Upon realizing that this afterlife was completely devoid of any civilization or structures and was essentially a sandbox he could shape to his liking, the man chuckled and shook his head. He took one look at the vast and fertile world that was now his own before expressing his thoughts aloud in a tone filled with both bitterness and excitement. And so our story begins.